Tamriel is most often known for its deep, intricate lore, its vast and beautiful landscapes, and the quests that lead you in and between all of these enjoyable phenomena. But what happens when you're weary of the road? What do you do when it gets too dark to experience all of this clearly? The answer for most is that they'll simply loiter for hours in the same spot, at least until their ankles are bitten by a rat or something. I posit there is a very underutilized and underappreciated feature of this world that many of us, including myself at one point, have often ignored. Although very unassuming, the inns of our fair land are run by well-intentioned and hard-working people. They allow us to rest in safe havens away from the wolves or miscreants prowling the wilderness. We may drink, dine, share in boisterous conversation, and make memories that are sometimes just as valuable as the treasure we seek. Between all of my adventures logged here in our meeting place, I have visited many a tavern to rest. Not all are created equal, and there are certainly things of note that I would like to share with you should you like to embark upon missions of academic nature. Without further ado, allow me to regale you of my findings on the Inns of the Elder Scrolls. This video is sponsored by no one. Yep, no one. Instead, I simply wanted to talk to you directly. These videos take a long time to create, and if you find them informative, funny, or just entertaining, it would mean a lot to me if you would both like and subscribe. These measures take no time at all but help immensely as a smaller channel, and without you I simply could not make this happen. I love speaking with you in the comments, discussing lore and sharing alternative ideas to what is presented in these videos, so please let me know what you think. I'm always around. With all that said, you will not hear anything else about subscribing, Patreon, etc. until the end of the video. Please enjoy the deep dive. As you know, I fancy myself an academic rather than a critic of local businesses. Be that as it may, there's value to broadening one's horizons, expanding their awareness outside of their own bubble of study. As I traveled to and from each of my research locations, these inns became the backbone of my adventure. I found myself noting the various details of each one, discerning minor and sometimes major differences that made for a unique experience here and there. Simply for fun, I decided along the way to start ranking these locations based upon a handful of criteria. Number 1, location. This concerns the area in which the tavern is set, whether it's proximal to important trade hubs, and so on. Number 2, presentation. I studied the quality of the buildings, their architecture, signage, etc. Number 3, amenities. The most important thing in the inn is the bed, and so it makes sense to discuss that, and the various other furnishings one can expect to enjoy during their stay. Number 4, the people. Are the staff kind? Do they have a story? Do they care for all people or discriminate among the crowd? Number 5, finally, the cost. Is it reasonably justified based upon the quality of the overall experience? This study contains information gathered from visits to over 70 different businesses. Each of these locations was chosen based upon one rule. They must have had at least one rentable bed at the time of my visit. There is but one exception to this guideline, and we will get to that toward the end of the study. To begin, we will briefly visit the years of 399 and 417 in the Third Era. Traveling back to year 399 of the Third Era, I visited the town of Eagle Moor in mainland Morrowind. At that time, most taverns across the Empire were similar despite their exact province. There was a standard issue sign of an overflowing mug, catching the eye of any traveler and coaxing them inside. This would bring profit to the Empire as well as to the locals. These places were host to any and all kinds of adventurers. Inside the Howling Griffin, for example, I ran across people who would not give me the time of day. Or worse, one that threatened to kill and eat me. Despite this, the reprieve from the cold was a welcome one. This building was warmed with tall torches whose flames never seemed to wane. The red stone floors also seemed to elicit comfort, although the origin of their color was a question I did not want the answer to. I soon found myself speaking to the patron of the establishment, who had only good things to discuss, though I admit we mostly spoke business. To begin, he asked me to retrieve a book for him from the local Mages Guild. It was apparently a tome of philosophy that meant a lot, and it had been loaned out for some time. I agreed to do so as it seemed easy enough. The 45 gold would also net me a better room to sleep in. It's important to note here that I often come across small quests when speaking to bartenders. They see and hear many things in their line of work, and if they deem you kind enough, they'll often share this information and send you on your way. I could not confirm this, but there were whispers around the Griffin that bartenders also occasionally gave maps to so-called hidden artifacts. In my case, the patron and I simply moved into his more conventional line of work, serving drinks and renting beds. There was a large array of beverages and they were sold very cheaply. Lager, stouts, ort gut, this place had them all. It was interesting to consider just how much prices had changed in the 30 years from this time to my own. Either way, I enjoyed both a lager and a stout. Then I asked whether there were any rooms free. In fact, there were multiple. They ranged from single to king suite, which I luckily had the coin to procure. This bed, he assured me, would offer better rest and natural healing than the others. He also offered to host me for multiple days, but ultimately I just needed the one. As he vigorously cleaned this very special mug, I began my way toward the bedroom. It was a spacious room with a grand bed. A bookshelf held many stories to keep me entertained, as well as various other oddities at which to gawk. A brazier in the corner allowed me to stay warm, and although I wanted nothing more than to sleep, I decided I should peek into the other rooms for comparison. Needless to say, mine was the best of the bunch. The others had no entertainment, simply an empty room with a bed at the end of a long hall. I will say, the beds all seemed quite clean, and if someone tried to enter your room, you would have about an hour to prepare before their knife should reach you. After getting some much needed rest, I headed out the door. My intention was to go right for the Mages Guild and recover Old Cruata's book. Instead, I noted the strange placement of the Laughing Golem, another tavern directly across from the first. No doubt there would be a monetary feud between them, but as I peeked into their rooms on offer, it seemed they were much the same. Wide awake and needless of another bed, I began hunting down the Mages Guild of Eagle Moor. The inside was filled with books, so many it would require many lifetimes to read. Human lifetimes, I should add. As a dark elf, we're luckily allotted much more time to read such texts. Consider it a benefit of your study here. Eventually, in the darkened halls of the guild, I found a long-bearded wizard toward the back. He offered me the book immediately, and I returned it to the bartender to pass along to Old Cruata. Gold in hand, I was thankful to have gotten both a nearly free room and a good night's rest. Moving forward by 6 years, I visited Western Daggerfall. The goal, of course, was to locate an inn. Instead, I found myself enchanted by the music of the streets. This song was a certified third-era smasher. I eventually did find a place at which to drink, and although the sign was quite indicative of the activity, I never did learn the name of the establishment. Inside was a bit cold, and the walls were striped with strong studded boards. Just around the corner was a room full of merry folk, including 2 musicians performing for the room. In the far corner was the patron, Tristan Morehouse. Although I was worried at the storage location of his quarry, i.e. the alcohol quite literally resting on the ground, the man himself was polite enough. He also offered food and drink, such as meat and gruel, though I was not quite hungry at the time. Instead, I asked him to stay one night at the inn. This cost 3 gold after all was said and done, and I was told to find an empty room. Note here that this is at least better than in Eagle Moor, where I was not told a thing about where to go. Down the hall, I found quite a few rooms with doors that mystically opened into and onto the beds themselves. I was worried about how this would affect my corporeal sleeping body, and so I moved on to another. Unfortunately, I moved into an area upon which it was not my business to intrude. The door was open though, so they forgave my mistake. Several empty closets later, I found a room with a nice empty bed, a desk, and 2 dressers. A singular lantern lit the room well enough, and it was here I decided I would rest. Before leaving the next morning, I figured I would thank Venoria, the tireless flutist. I think she was pleased. I came across another bar and stepped inside for a quick comparison. This one was darker, and unfortunately a small drummer boy was made to entertain the shady-looking customers. He had a large smile that immediately left his face if spoken to. In fact, I had never before seen a straighter line on a human visage. His customer service skills were truly admirable. In one corner of the room was the supposed barkeep, although I'm not sure one could say this place was kept. Nervously, I asked for a room so that I could make a comparison to the other place. With a strong gaze and an affirming nod, Robert Redford offered me to stay. My room was quite nice with a clean green bed. I didn't dare rest in it for fear of what the other patrons would do while I slept. And so I left Daggerfall and made the comforting journey back to late 3rd Era Morrowind. My homeland, although wonderful to me, is considered treacherous and difficult for others. I fail to see why. For those avoidant of the wild beauty in Vvardenfell, there are many towns at which they can stay, from the massive and confusing Vivec City to the small and simple imperial settlement of Pelagiad. Nearly each of the major towns have at least one tavern at which to rest. The architecture and furnishings of these locations have improved over the past 22 years, and so it makes sense to begin our ranking system here. Fear not, the arrows are not being compared to one another in most cases. This would not be fair. Instead, they're simply being ranked among their peers. Within Vvardenfell are 18 inns that match our guidelines. Each of them have rentable beds as well as food and other various services, often depending on who is staying there alongside you. Another change over the past 22 years is that people have come to understand themselves a bit better, as well as the importance of a good night's rest. They learn that they commit their knowledge better to memory when sleeping in a safe location, free of worry about attack or the elements. Of course, they sought out taverns. Sleeping on the soggy marshlands of the Bitter Coast, for example, does not allow for sweet dreams, and so Vvardenfell and the other provinces made it a point to better cater to adventurers such as we. The real journey begins here, with a walk into Aldrune after one of my less fruitful Black Lichen harvests. Situated on the western side of the town of Aldrune is the Aldscar Inn. Much like Aldrune means Old Home in Aldmaris, this means Old Scar, which is a reference to the giant crab shell nearby in which Great House Redoran holds its council chambers. As the locals will tell you, Scar was a giant crab that was defeated long ago. Its innards were carved out and the vacancy replaced with businesses and political holdings. Hence, all the locations within are noted as being under Scar. The Inn of Discussion is shaped strangely, as if also carved from a giant crustacean. It has clear signage of a scrib, which you will soon see means Tavern Here. It also contains strange spikes on top, is encrusted with 3 green emeralds on the back, and has a very odd vertical gap in its middle. It seems this could have been done to make room for pedestrians to travel through town, but that seems more indicative of a claustrophobic city center, not the open and breathable area we see here. Perhaps it was a natural feature of an ancient crab that simply could not be worked around. Soon after I arrived in town, one of the common sandstorms began ravaging the place. I almost tripped over a trauma root making my way to the door, but luckily managed to walk in and enjoy the calm atmosphere. Inside were beautiful paper lamps, planters of deep red scathecraw, and even some fire ferns. I wondered momentarily as to how they survived the low light setting. Then I remembered that anthocyanins, the pigments responsible for red and purple coloring in plants, also show in other plants just before the winter months, the time when plants are trying to take in all the light they can during the shortened days. This, along with their already drought-tolerant nature, was enough to make sense for me. As the sandstorm raged outside, I took in the understated beauty of the inn. There were rugs woven with similar colors to the plants, engravings in the walls, and the calm muttering of conversation just up the stairs. There were many tables set with common wood and ceramic dishes. As we will see is quite common for Dunmer taverns, there were also many messes. An overturned chair here, a bottle on the ground there. And this was nothing compared to the room below, where the floor was littered in bottles everywhere you looked. Looking past this, I focused on the bar and its selection. The stools and table were clean, and the back table filled with bottles and mugs ready to go. The downstairs section maintained the deep red style. Tapestries on the wall matched the large rug in the center of the floor. The overall lighting of each area was nice as well. The storage was fairly clean, and I had no worries of food or drink quality. Moving on to the last level, the inn had a basement dug into the ground. There were beautiful pillars carved for stability and large candlesticks throughout. Some private tables allowed for more discreet discussion, and just under the stairs were 2 large kegs, one of them having an apparent leak, as there was a wooden mug just below the spigot. I also really enjoyed this corner where 2 people could sit and have tea, resting upon the blue-green cushions. But most important to our stay would be the bedroom. Speaking with the kind Boderi Ferrano, I perused her selection of food and drink. She then offered me a room at the standard rate of 10 gold, which we will see is a commonly held law throughout the province. Either that or it's a very strong agreement, considering both the best and worst locations will maintain that same price. Following her directions, I went downstairs, then to the first room on the right. The first thing I noticed is that it was quite small. The bed was fine, the decoration matching the hall, and there was a nightstand and chest for anything I needed to set down. My major complaint with this room is that there was no door. There would be absolutely no privacy at all, and with only one guard standing upstairs, perhaps I should have thought better than to rest here. Still, the place proved good enough for the other 2 staying. One was a bard, and her room contained both of her drums, as well as her rapier and a stack of gold on the sandstone sill. This I thought was quite foolhardy, especially considering how easy it would be for someone to creep in at night, watching until she fell asleep, only then to step in and take her belongings. The other tenant was a mage and a big reader at that. It was unclear how long he was staying, but he carried 3 tomes with him into his room. This was enough for me to respect the man, as I am also very much a reader. Overall, my stay at the Aldscar Inn was a decent one. The people were mostly kind, the food and drink okay, the decor wonderful, and the location quite close to major shops and businesses. My major complaints were the lack of a door to my room and the inability or unwillingness of staff to maintain order and clean the place up. It was hard to sleep that night with them rummaging about upstairs. For these reasons, the Aldscar Inn gets a 3-star rating. Breaking character for a quick second, I wanted to talk about the structure of this building. The 3 emeralds I mentioned before did not directly correlate to any windows inside. Also, the large vertical gap is truly represented here as seen in the construction set. This is a very cool detail, as it would be all too easy to just ignore that. This is already an out-of-the-box situation, but they went the extra mile to make both the interior and exterior make sense, something we will see is not always the case. Let us continue our journey into the town of Balmora, which hosts not 1 but 4 separate taverns of distinction. Balmora is a city well known to all visitors of Vardenfell. It's as full of life as it is business, and its western district is often packed with people, each searching for success in sales or information. Of course, it also has more than its fair share of inns at which these visitors can rest. The first of these is perhaps the least comfortable, not to get ahead of myself. As soon as you enter the city proper, you can turn right and reach 2 inns directly next to each other. If you have the misfortune to take the second left door, you'll find yourself in the council club. On the outside, it looks decent enough. There's clear signage, some storage for basic goods, and a clean green window. There's also an upstairs section with tables for drinking and gambling, something no other tavern in the city can boast. In the corner are a bucket and a broom, showing that the proprietor at least cares about the cleanliness of the place. But inside, you'll be met with strange, unsavory characters that leave you with a constant hand on the hilt of your blade, or your pocketbook. They offer services of sneak and lockpick training, as well as other activities that many would consider those of a ne'er-do-well. Despite the very uncomfortable atmosphere and my bias of knowing these people to be from the Kamana Tong, there are some positives to discuss. The tables are nice and well kept. The building itself is well fortified with crossing wood beams adding structure to the ceiling. Even the lighting is enjoyable, with a blue lantern here and common candles there. Actual silverware is paired with the more basic dishes, which is a slight step up from the first inn we visited. Still, it's questionable as to how these people managed to afford the minor luxury. Storage is found both within a dedicated closet as well as a corner of the stairs. Moving past this, we find ourselves at the end of a long hall. On either side is a door leading to a room for rent. On the left is a space reserved for an unnamed patron who apparently did not want to be disturbed. Questioning that information, I stepped in to find a messy room, perhaps with signs of a struggle. The person's armor was also still placed within the complimentary chest. This worried me very much, and I immediately wondered whether the host and his gang had simply killed a client. Nervous, I stepped across the hall to my own room. There were pretty green tapestries and rugs, and the bed was decent, save for some tears on the blanket. To be quite honest, I didn't feel safe sleeping here. I simply read a bit until enough time had passed so as to alleviate any suspicion of my discomfort. I promptly left, feeling all eyes upon me until I finally exited to the open air. I give this inn 3 stars. I had privacy, was offered drinks, and was even told I could learn different techniques from the other patrons. However, my bias of knowledge mixed with the strange looks and unexplained missing person from the other room, these all left me quite uncomfortable. Down the road, just past my friend Dorissa's bookstore, is a tavern called 8 Plates. It looks unassuming just like the rest of the businesses here, but is easily marked by a scrib tapestry outside. There are also some storage containers along the wall in which the owner has placed various objects for those in need. Peeking in this crate revealed a ring of fireball, a very useful tool in the right hands. The interior is very calmly lit and sparsely decorated. A cold blue glow comes from the various paper lanterns hanging on the ceiling. Despite this lighting choice and the general cold feeling from the stone walls, it actually felt fairly homey. The central room was large, able to host around 25 people with no issue. There were wooden tables, benches, and sturdy bar stools near the tap. Strangely, one stool sat alone. Perhaps that was for a specific patron. All dishes were well organized right there in view. Dolnea did make a clear attempt to keep this place tidy, despite the overturned cup here and there. As for the alcohol, there was a decent supply, with Comberry brandy filling a keg behind the counter. Below was a bucket, and I cannot imagine how many times a customer had asked Dolnea to give them the big mug. It seems even members of the great houses can be messy, as this chair and drink are toppled over on the floor. I began to wonder exactly why no publican was hiring guards to prevent such belligerence. Miss Ralal herself, though, was very cordial. She even asked if I wanted to participate and try to entertain the patrons. My nerves racing, I quickly considered my options. Then I remembered. I played the lute a few times in my youth. Yes, surely this would be the thing to do. So it turns out they didn't like it all that much. Still, Dolnea allowed me to hide my shame and myself by renting out a room. This was a boon since I almost scared away her customers. Just down the stairs and to the right, I found a very small room, complete with a decent bed, a door, and a carafe for serving myself water or brandy. All in all, the place was very nice and comfortable, the prices were decent, and the location was directly across from the razor hole where I used to buy my arrows. I give the 8 plates 4 stars, just short of 5 since Dolnea never told me why it was named such, and the room was very small with no storage. Back toward the western entrance to town, directly adjacent to the council club, is a place called the Lucky Lockup. Along its walls are crates of ingredients, drying out for use in serving guests, and just across from the entrance is the Siltstrider platform. This is very convenient for travelers, and I wonder just how much gold the owners of these establishments had to pay for their opportunistic placement. Walking into the Lucky Lockup, I found a small but comfortable main room. The characteristic red and brown colors of Vardenfell shone here, through tapestries, rugs, and even more scathe croplands. Storage was clean and clear, and the food preparation table was placed right in front of patrons. That way they could help themselves, or, if desired, they could watch the publican make dishes for them. Extra ingredients and salted meats were kept out of the way in a large closet. Much like the other taverns, there were messes here as well, although this was a little ridiculous. 2 bottles, a goblet, and a chair all knocked over right in front of the owner. It was very unfortunate, and I had to believe that it must have happened right then and there. It seems Hickam was not very successful on his last assassination attempt. This must have fueled the drunken outrage that caused the mess. And perhaps people were simply too scared to say anything, seeing as how he's very clear about his profession. Speaking to the owner Benunius, I was shown to my room for the night. It was small but clean. There were bottles to drink, low lighting, and a chest to place my items in. Overall, it was a very comfortable room for a short stay. After calming down the aggressive situation below, I was offered training in multiple skills both by Hickam and Toddwindy. Each of them taught short blade, sneak, and acrobatic skills. Since they both worked in similar professions, it did not seem a far reach to me that they perhaps had an argument shortly before my arrival, leading to this scene on the first floor. Determined to redeem myself after the poor display downtown, I asked the bard Chuna to borrow his lute. I shook off my nerves and walked on stage, a very small stage with barely any room to stand, I might add. There I performed. Hello everyone, I know things have been a little hectic tonight, and I thought I might help calm it down a bit. So here's a little song. So, what do you think?
Now that's something I didn't need to see.
You waste my time, Dunmer.
Clumsy oaf.
That went much better than 8 plates. At least my life wasn't threatened. Overall, I give this place a solid 4 stars. It would be 5 if rabble-rousers could be kept in check, otherwise great establishment. So far, all the places we've visited in Balmora have been in the business district. There's but one more tavern in town, and it sits in the southwestern corner of the residential area. It looks much like the others and has a small balcony from which to look out over the city. There are also containers outside with similar items as the other places, free to those in need. Small sums of gold as well as enchanted weapons can be found here. The interior is tinted blue just like 8 plates. This is a calming ambience and one I quite enjoy. Decorations through the stairways are somewhat lacking, with just a shelf holding drinkware and a candle. Of course, there are storage containers around, holding what I assume are the quarry of those hosting shops here. These include the Khajiit and Nord near the doorway, who sell lockpicks and cheap weapons. On the bottom floor is the most interesting room, playing host to the bar and a few patrons. Finds grow along the walls in a beautiful, light-defying manner. The green really captures one's attention compared to everything that is toned out by the blue. The storage is also quite clean, contrasting with the mess under the table nearby. Just another Vardenfell bar, I suppose. In the corner was a lute, free to play, but I decided to let that one go. I would need more practice before performing again. Most of the patrons have normal jobs, but the Argonian is a healer. At least he told me such, but then turned around and said he didn't offer any services. This was quite odd. The Khajiit next to him had no problem selling me picks and probes. I should add, of course, that this establishment is the Balmoran headquarters of the Thieves Guild. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of thievery in general. However, sometimes those of a noble status need reminding of who put them there. And if this is the most organized and least dangerous method of sending those messages, who am I to judge? For an easy 10 gold, I rented a small cozy room upstairs. It came with all the necessary amenities, save for a chest in which to place my belongings. The bed was also engraved with flowers, which was very nice. You may ask, Onyx, how can you sleep in a den of thieves? My answer to this is that members of the Thieves Guild do not prey upon those with whom they have a mutual respect. And as I leave that sentence for you to ponder over, I also take my last look before leaving Balmora again. Such a beautiful city, great stores, cozy taverns, and most importantly, many nice people to meet.
Get out of here.
When the Imperials moved into Morrowind, they set up a handful of forts. Where able, they also built civilian settlements. One of the most important of these is the town of Caldera, built near a major ebony deposit in the region. Within the walls of this town are a few businesses, a Mages Guild chapter house, the castle, and some residential buildings. Of primary interest to us is the tavern, called Shank's Shovel. This inn is 3 stories tall with a unique exterior. The roof is thatched with straw, overlaying strong wooden beams, and there's a sky bridge connecting from the building proper to the upper level of Varric Germain's store next door. As we will come to see, Shank has built a nice room directly above the store. As to why this is the case, whether these two know each other well, or if it was a deal brokered between Shank and the last trader, I doubt we will ever truly know. The buildings in Caldera often have these convex windows jutting from the structure. Although clearly represented within the tavern, I feel something is amiss. The distance between the window and the door on the exterior is much shorter than is seen inside. For that reason, and the luxury he's been able to afford, I suggest Shank is actually a sorcerer disguising himself as a publican. Moving on, let's talk of the interior of the shovel. There are beautifully crafted tapestries hung on every wall over somewhat worn wallpaper. They convey trees, flowers, and other plants, and go very well with the exquisitely carved wood beams and paneling. Although I saw few visitors to enjoy them, the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling are quite nice. Another messy display exists in the adjacent room to the bar, which is just par for the course at this point. Even an imperial town full of guards could not be bothered to keep peace at the tavern. Speaking on the bar itself, it's very clean and forms a comfortable central area at which to drink and dine. Dishes and food are stored nicely on shelves and in cabinets, as well as containers that allow herbs to dry. There's only one small room on the 2nd floor, and the 3rd floor is where our attention is most required. This beautiful hall is decorated with fantastic displays of imperial and Nordic craftsmanship. Nearly every wooden surface is etched into with some sort of geometric or swirling pattern. When walking through, I almost felt as though I wasn't allowed to touch anything. Getting to the main room, I must say this was the best looking I had seen so far. There was a chandelier over the bed, complimentary bottles of wine, storage for my gear, a very clean bed on an engraved frame, and a table at which to write these thoughts down. Although this was very nice, I couldn't help but wonder what lay in the room down the sky bridge. Sneaking my way in, I slowly opened the door and allowed myself a peek inside. It was immaculate, of course. A 4-post bed, fine china, green rugs and tapestries. This was almost regal. In the center was a table at which Shank probably hosted friends and business partners. As I left, I was asked a rather blunt question.
So what do you want?
To be your friend, Shank. To be your friend. Continuing our journey through the Imperial establishments, I found myself visiting the home of Vardenfell's preeminent bread baker. Agning, a very talented Nord and the only person in Vardenfell with a consistent supply of bread, hosts a tavern called Six Fishes in Ebonheart, the primary Imperial settlement on the island. I never did ask where he got the name, but I came up with an idea myself. Perhaps fishing through the Sea of Ghosts is not very lucrative, and one time he brought up a net containing only 6 fish. This building, although not as tall, is very similar to Shank's Shovel. The architecture is a familiar mix of Imperial and Nordic, and there are vines grown across the bricks. It sports a sign out front with a stag on it, much like the shovel, and has an active chimney promising comfort and food within. All of this was on my mind as I stepped into Six Fishes that day, my stomach rumbling. The main hall was very clean, and all the patrons seemed to be behaving themselves, perhaps because a guard was in attendance. Dishes were stored on shelves along the walls, allowing customers to serve themselves at will. Regulars could simply walk in, grab a mug and a plate, and make their request of Agning. Over behind the bar, he would make their meals on a low-set table, which would definitely hurt my back after repeated use. Hopefully he has a low stool or something to sit on in the meanwhile. Although not the richest by any means, the silver and woodware served their purpose, and the cost saved there seems to have gone into caring for the establishment and its many forms of comfortable lighting. In the basement are large kegs, something we didn't see in the shovel, where Shank probably keeps imported drinks under the counter. Here, the alcohol is fresh, made easy by the tavern's proximity to the port. My room for the night was very spacious. There was a small sapling inside, kept fed through the plenty windows, which could also be shut at night for peace of mind. A simple clean bed sat in the corner, next to a nightstand and a carafe full of water. Cups are provided downstairs as mentioned before. Although there was no storage chest for my belongings, the overall comfort and cleanliness of the location was more than welcome. I fell asleep as soon as I hit the pillow, due in no small part to a stomach full of buttered bread from our dear friend Agning. My next destination was a difficult one, and although I have spoken of these locations in alphabetical order for ease of understanding, I should mention that my stay at the Aldscar Inn was part of the journey to this particular location. Before the arrival of the Nerevarine, the Red Mountain was plagued by the Blight, a foul red storm worse than even the ash blows of Aldrune. To lock both this storm and its creator inside, the Tribunal came together to form the Ghost Fence. Using their ill-begotten power, they made a small measure at cleaning up their own mess by forming this fence around the entire region. All-powerful as they may be, they could not keep cliff racers from escaping and spreading the resultant disease. But I digress. At the front of this fence is the Ghost Gate, at which dozens of skilled Dunmer warriors are stationed to prevent the escape of Corporus beasts and the like. Since they are far from safety, they primarily rely upon deliveries of food from buoyant armigers stationed elsewhere, or on occasion, new ordinators proving their mettle to their superiors. These soldiers typically sleep in the bunkers of the Tower of Dawn, but they are not the only visitors. Those hard of faith and skin travel here to visit the shrine on their pilgrimage. They tend to sleep in the Tower of Dusk, which appropriately hosts a bed and minor food and drink services. Although the armigers are generally more socially buoyant than the ordinators, even they were curious as to why I arrived. I simply told them I was a pilgrim, but they did not seem to believe it. Either way, they let me stay in a small room, walled off from the bar. It wasn't luxurious, but the bed was quite large and the room was spacious. What it lacked in decoration, it made up for in comfort and storage. Within the furniture of the place were carvings in Daedric. Once translated, they read AVS in a repeating pattern. This of course referred to the Tribunal, Almalexia, Vivec, and Sothasil. Overall, my stay here was not the worst. The host was less cordial than I'd hoped, but there were never any real issues. Despite that, I was eager to leave a place considered holy by followers of the Tribunal. Though it is true they somewhat halted the spread of the Blight, I questioned their plan once it eventually failed. As they were cut off from the source of their divinity, they knew their power was waning. Perhaps that is why I truly came here, to witness the once magnificent monument in its silent, useless state. It would be yet another reminder of the Nerevarine and their selflessness. Easing back into more conventional settings, let us speak of the inn at Margon. This Redoran town sits quite near the northwestern corner of the Ghost Fence. Saving myself some trouble, I simply went back to Aldrune and paid for the Self-Strider services. Similar to Aldrune, the buildings in Margon are also carved from large bugs and crustaceans, packed together with mud, resin, and other materials. This means the tavern in town, the Andis Trade House, was built very similarly to the Aldskar Inn. The trade house sits up on a hill almost as if exalted. I would have loved to have seen some of the heavy drinkers stumble their way down the steps leading up to it. Once inside, I was met with heavy déjà vu. It seems the Redoran have a very specific custom when building taverns. Not only are the walls and floors structured the same way, no doubt due to limitations formed naturally in the ancient creature's bone structures, but the planters, lighting, and dishware seem to be uniform. One distinguishing feature of this place is the segmented bar placement. Strangely, it's been split up into 3 distinct areas. Monse Andis, the owner of the tavern, told me she prefers an open concept, and that the segment off by itself is for her during the downtime, not a punishment for dunce drinkers. Directly in front of her, which I could not just ignore, was a tipped-over drink and a chair. There was no effort to pick this up, and looking around offered more examples that did not bode well for cleanliness of the place. It seemed to be fine other than those points of laziness. In fact, I was offered to tour the middle floor, and what I found there was quite interesting. Below the top floor was the storage room / kitchen. There were bottles of all manner of alcohol, sujama, grief, you name it. In the center of the room was a prep table so that Monse could make food for the patrons. It was filled with bread and ash yams at the time of my visit, and unfortunately, scrib jelly. The roaring fire and promise of yams did much to make me forget about any messes upstairs. Before the night was over, I did order a few yams. They were decently sweet, well, as sweet as they get in the ashy soil of Vardenfell. If the food wasn't enough to convince me of quality, the bedroom was. It was huge, with more storage than I could ever need. The bed was quite large, there were bottles of wine nearby, and finally, a small dining table set in the corner. This was by far the best tavern room I had visited to this point. As a final note, the basement level in which my room sat was strangely empty. There were many tables but no cutlery or drinkware. Stranger yet, there were 2 customers hanging around. I knew they weren't staying because the only other room was rented by an Imperial who seemed rather private. Either way, my stay here was wonderful. Lots of time to read by candlelight, enjoy my food in peace, and think of where I would be going next. This was a 5-star stay. Pelagiad is one of the first settlements travelers from the mainland will come across. That is, if they take the roads and not the Siltstrider from Seydanin. This town has no means of easy travel, whether by strider, boat, or Mages Guild transporter. Still, the walk is well worth it. There are beautiful plants all around, including my favorite, the stoneflower. Better yet, you can see the Emperor parasols all over the place. In the middle of Pelagiad is the Halfway Tavern. It's situated about halfway between the buildings of the upper residential district, and Pelagiad itself is about halfway between Vivec and Balmora. For whatever reason it was named this, the place is a great stop where many adventurers come to relax. It's also the final Imperial establishment in our discussion of Vardenfell. In terms of style, the tavern is almost exactly the same as Six Fishes and nearby Ebonheart, right down to the vines and signage. The interior of the tavern was just as spacious but filled with more tables. In the corner was a bar manned by Drelasa Ramathran, a friend to the Thieves Guild. As such, members of the faction do often stop by. The place was very clean, and I didn't notice a single mess during my stay. Alcohol was stored in kegs on the bottom level. Just like at Six Fishes, I thought of how useful this would be as a barkeep, but how difficult it would be as a delivery person to carry the full barrels downstairs. It may also have been a false positive, but my alchemical sense activated once I was there, as if a potion of healing lay somewhere nearby. I could smell the mixture of shredded marshmallow and ground salt rice. Alas, my eyes are not as good as my nose, but don't call me a guar. The bed at the tavern was great, though strangely there was an iron tonto hidden behind the frame. Whether this was forgotten or planted, I didn't know, but I made sure to tell Drelasa about it. Ultimately, what makes this tavern great is something that shows extreme bias. Apart from the architecture, the comfort, the cleanliness, etc., is the fact that this is the place where I met my most special friend, Anasi. I still recall stepping into the tavern on my first visit. I was escaping a rain shower after harvesting stoneflowers. I came in, and a Khajiit was laughing at me, staring at my drenched form.
Wet fur.
A few words passed, a few cares were shared, and suddenly we'd lived together. I'll spare you any more details, but suffice to say, if this tavern did not exist, I would not have met Anasi, and so it gets 5 stars from me. Traveling into Telvanni territory is always bittersweet for me. I love the mycological architecture, the wild ways that Mycelia is taught to twist and form by gifted mages. Then I recall their practices, how they view people as commodities to be bought and sold. In truth, no business other than this study took me here. It was a bit of an excuse to sightsee and catch up on how things were outside of Pelagiad and Balmora. That way we might better know what we do and don't agree with. Far as hole in the wall is a small building in Sadrith Mora, carved into a mushroom. It had clear signage, and the interiors were much less confusing than the Gateway Inn, for which I have much to say momentarily. The interior was lit with the blue paper lanterns I adore, something that goes very well with the mycelial structures and aromas. It felt so alien yet so familiar, as someone who often roams the Ascadian Isles. As mentioned, the place is quite small. On the top floor is the bar, where Farah, the publican, sells food and drink. Behind her were 2 kegs, along with a broom and mop in case something spilled. At least she cared to keep the place tidy. But on the lower floor were 2 people making this more difficult. In a dark room with moody candles and shelves of bottles, these others saw fit to toss drinks on the floor. I momentarily wondered if the dryness of any remaining alcohol would affect the fungal structure, causing it to wither in spots. Perhaps the magic of the Telvanni keeps these and other elements from eroding the surfaces. My room at the inn was very cozy, and it was honestly somewhat difficult to stay awake as I took notes on the experience. When I laid down, I looked up at the miniature mushroom tree hanging over me. Soon it would need more space, to be transplanted outside probably. Maybe they had magical means of enhancing the pot soil to never lose nutrients. These were my last thoughts before I woke up. I grabbed my papers from the desk and put them in my pocket. Passing the market, I made my way to exit town. But of course, we still need to discuss my entry point. The entrance to Sadrith Mora is a large gateway at which travelers are marked and recorded. The prefect there is the front-facing end of a racket known as the Hospitality Papers. They sell you your papers for 25 gold and tell you to always keep them on your person. However, I have a sneaking suspicion that these papers are just a scam and that there is no legal precedent for them among Telvanni law officials, unless they're a part of the scheme. Before moving into the review of the Gateway Inn, I must make mention of another event. As it turns out, there's a ghost haunting one of the rooms. Even though it's often vanquished, it just returns the next day. It immediately reeked of conjuration to me, but as to why someone would spend their time doing this, I was at a loss. At least until I found the culprit, who easily admitted to it. Her reasoning was that the prefect from before had tried to get her in major trouble for not having her papers, basically extorting her. She did all this as a prank to annoy him. I felt it was righteous, so when she asked me to deliver a little letter to him, I did so, but not before peeking inside. My favorite lines include cannibal vampire anchovies, and her proposal that a profound and displeasing odor arises from the prefect of hospitality. He was quite angry and immediately put together who it was. She wasn't worried regardless, and I doubt the errand boy will get any so-called justice. With that out of the way, I wanted to share some things about the inn itself. The bar was okay, and Ari did her best to keep things civil among visitors. However, the place employed servants, which I'm altogether against. I asked to view one of the rooms and, once allowed in, was not overly impressed. All in all, it was a room with a bed, a chair, and a more spindly version of the fungal tree seen in Farah's hole in the wall. Perhaps this one, like its workers, had been neglected. It was at this point that I decided to leave and go visit the other inn, where I then decided to stay. Though still in Telvanni territory, the inn at Tel Brenora was a bit more pleasant of an experience. Buildings, if you can call them that, were more clearly noted, and it was easy to find Sethin's trade house just outside the main tower. The entrance hall was an elongated oval, the walls covered in purple tapestries. There were plenty of tables, but only one customer I saw. He seemed a little irritated, so I stepped past him and began my way upstairs. The bar was tidy except for one bottle that Lorena Sethin, the proprietor, could not see. I passed it to her and asked for something to eat. She only had the basics, ash yams and quama eggs. This was fine enough, so I bought a few of those, and also asked for the key to the only available room. Problem is, there was no door to it. Taking 10 gold, Lorena walked me down the hall to a small room with a hammock. The last visitor must have drank themselves silly in order to feel comfortable enough to sleep, seeing as how there were many bottles on the desk by the bed. This was indeed my only choice for rest in town though, so I had to take it. Also, I neglected to mention some magic I witnessed just near the bar. One of the tendrils of hyphae stretched down from the ceiling but never reached the floor. When I bumped against it, it felt hollow. Chancing a look beneath, I confirmed my suspicions. The stipe was completely hollow, even more so than the common mushroom. Nay, it was paper thin. Either someone magically enhanced the strength of the network comprising the building, or this place was at risk of collapse. There was no telling whether or not the other filaments were solid. Across the hall from my room was Lorena's. It was much larger and more comfortable, of course, but unfortunately that is not where I slept. No, I slept on a thinly woven hammock, worrying about the structural integrity of my hostel. As I left the next morning, I was inclined to experience something positive. I walked up to the Breton near the door and told him a long joke. So I said, "Tel Brenora what?"
You're such a bore. Go away.
Couldn't play the lute well. No one likes my jokes, and everyone was mad at me for not visiting the dungeons in Daggerfall during that study. But oh well, I'm still living, and there's another tavern calling my name. Things haven't been the same since the attack on Harvest. Wait, wrong study. Our penultimate tavern within Telvanni territory lies in Tel Mora, north-northwest of Sadrith Mora, and directly east of the split between Tel Voss and Voss. Confusing, I know, which is why I employed the use of a sailor to deliver me there. Although similar to the other Telvanni towns, this one was situated on the water, which made things both easier and more difficult for travel depending on who you asked. For me, I just followed the hewn hyphae walkways toward the banister with a scrib on it. This was the tavern called The Covenant. Just inside was a Bosmer woman behind a counter and a shelf with a very limited alcohol supply. The woman's name was Natess, and I asked her to fill me in on current happenings in town. Just then, she brought something to my attention, telling me there were no men here since Mistress Stratha doesn't like them. No men, huh? Tell me more. Just upstairs, I found Therild tending the bar. She was one of the sisters running the place. It was very unique, and despite my sex, she tended to me just as well. Perhaps better than that even, since I was offered moon sugar. I guess trust is earned quickly here. Either that or Therild knows how much the sugar's worth, and the Imperials don't dare try express power in Telvanni territory. She also showed me to my room, if you can call it that. It was a small area just off the stairs with 3 translucent partitions. I chose to sleep in my armor that night rather than to have someone walk in, much like at Sethin's Trade House or the Old Scar. Apart from my sleeping conditions, the place was nice. Drinks were actually on the house, or at least they came with the rental. I had a bottle by the bed with virtually unlimited refills. I explored around the higher floor where Therild told me visitors like to eat. During my stay though, there was no one here. Just then I considered a possible reason. A floating blue lamp hovered over a nearby table. Maybe everyone was scared off, thinking it was another haunting like that at the Gateway Inn in Sadrith Mora. I tried asking Borwin about it, but she didn't have much to say on the matter. She did, however, offer training if I ever felt the need. This was random but appreciated. As I went to sleep, I heard the sounds of the sisters cleaning up the place, but never was I bothered. It seems the Sisters of the Covenant were much kinder than counterparts I've read about in extra-dimensional texts. Regardless of why and for whom it was built, the grandiose city of Vivec is a wonder to behold. Within each canton are numerous businesses, including bookstores, apothecaries, and more. And of course, there are places for visitors to rest between their shopping ventures. The first of these we will visit is the Black Shark Corner Club. This tavern is named after the giant beetle native to the Grazelands and sees lots of business due to its location in the Foreign Quarter. This is the most commonly traversed canton by adventurers, as the southern cantons are mostly residential or great house based. With these thoughts in mind, I entered the tavern expecting lots of company. Instead, I was met with an Argonian backed to the wall and 3 Dunmer facing him angrily. I decided to ask what the problem was. It boiled down to racism, simply put. These Dunmer were telling the Argonian to leave, though he only wanted to relax in the bar. I tried settling things peacefully, but the publican, Rarel, would not intervene on my behalf. I didn't get the feeling he wanted these people here either, but perhaps he was too scared to be on their bad side. Thus, my only recourse was to threaten them with violence. Now, I'm not often one to do such a thing, but racism is one of those points where I draw the line, and unfortunately for these thugs, I was forced to draw 3 more lines in red ink. After this point, Hulia the Argonian was allowed to finish his brandy, and Geralt behind the counter quickly accepted my request of a room at the tavern. The bedroom was quite nice, with more amenities and decoration than most others I'd visited so far. The tapestries matched well with the red and green rug, which in turn incorporated the color of the bed and wall hangings for a full theme. There was ample storage, a lockable chest which opened to the room key, and a small dining table in the corner with a large carafe of water. Speaking of the rest of the tavern, it was generally comfortable. There were paper lanterns hovering above clean wooden tables with only a few overturned drinks on top. There was a very large section downstairs as well, just past the inn room. All the tables there were very clean and mostly empty, perhaps because of the incident upstairs. In the adrenaline, I didn't hear or focus on much of anything but removing the problem at hand. On the ground was an expensive ring molded in shadow. A small table in the corner looked to be set up for a couple drinking wine. I wondered if one of the two dropped it, and so I took it back upstairs before heading to bed. Rarel, still unnerved by the display, took it quickly and placed it under the counter. In my defense, I offered to clean up the mess, with Hulia's help, of course. Just like the Black Shark Corner Club, the Flowers of Gold Tavern was placed within one of the cantons, Redoran to be exact. And thankfully, unlike the other location, this one was very peaceful. I could tell I was going to like it by one look. How they got the vines to grow inside I had no idea, but the owner clearly had a green thumb as she cared for many potted gold canet flowers native to the wilds just outside in the Ascadian Isles. Just behind Serosi were shelves full of drinks, very neat and organized. On top were 2 helmets, 1 iron, and 1 steel. She quietly told me a story for each, of battles fought and won, but at great cost. Without being clear, it seems she was hinting that one belonged to a late partner, and the other, judging by a small scar on her hand, may have been worn by her in the distant past. Regardless of what profession she used to employ, Serosi Radabar was very kind, offering drinks for cheap. It was here where I had my first real moment of relaxation. I could smell the gold canet as Serosi filled another glass from the tab, a strong and invigorating Mazte. I could clearly taste the comberry which, I had no doubt, Serosi had gathered on a venture just outside the city. Downstairs was another very calm room, lit with silently flickering candles and the enjoyable scent of flowers. Reddish-purple tapestries and rugs covered every surface, and although there was a drink or two tossed around, I couldn't help but feel at home. I would never toss one myself, but I can understand how one could feel so relaxed here as to simply not care. Hell, someone even left their gold on a table, tipping Serosi for her hospitality, not worried in the slightest about someone taking it. I was so engrossed in the service, as well as the massive list of alchemical ingredients she was offering, to even ask Serosi about a room to sleep in. The room itself was nothing grand, but there were flowers at the footrest, a good sight to wake up to. She was clearly doing a lot with a little, and I was very thankful. This was an easy 5 stars from me. Even I get lost in the city sometimes, so for my next destination, I took a ride on a gondola. Soon I found myself in the Telvanni Canton. There were mushroom tree saplings and everything was lit with nice blue lights, but those betrayed the true atmosphere of the place. Entering a bar known as the Lizard's Head, I knew I was in for something. I just didn't know what. There was no explanation on the title from the publican, Minara Othan, and so I was left to wonder. The bar was strangely long, formed in the shape of an inverted L, which rounded the back corner. Each table had nice candles on it, but nothing else. The physical bar was very long, perhaps the longest I had seen in all my travels thus far. It was very empty though, devoid of entertaining chatter or complaints about work. The only customers I saw were an Argonian drinking with himself and a Nord who beckoned me over. He asked me for some Mazte and offered a secret in exchange. I was intrigued enough to oblige. Ignoring my obvious Dunmeri ancestry, Imbioff spoke of his people and mine and who used to own the lands we drank on. He told me of an old Nord hero that was apparently buried within this island, underground, in a tomb, on a boat. Then, as he could see I didn't believe him, he handed me a key etched with the name of that Nord's weapon. Imbioff was going home to Skyrim to die. He said the alcohol was killing him. I felt complicit, but knew I could not have foreseen this. I simply nodded and thanked him, unsure if I would ever use the key or not. After all the things I've seen in my adventures, I'm not sure why it seemed odd to me. Perhaps it was the idea of a boat floating deep underground, yet Imbioff spoke with such conviction I could not ignore it. Maybe someday I'll go and reclaim Stormkiss. If not for me, then a friend. And perhaps I'll even find other treasures waiting for me. I asked Minara for a room and found it just across from the bar. It was fairly spacious with a green theme, bitter green potted in the corner, and plenty of storage. Overall, a good room. As I explored the rest of the bar, I found a chatterless hall downstairs and something much worse. I peeked into the storeroom to be nosy, hoping to check whether or not I could trust the alcohol served above. Instead, I found something diabolical. There, mounted as though a weekend catch, was the head of an Argonian labeled Scourge. I was startled, to say the least. I forgot about my room completely, then took the head up to the front and presented it to Minara. She had nothing to say. Tigla, though, promptly set his mug down and left, with me close behind. Breaking character for a moment, I wanted to explain the Easter egg with the head of Scourge. See, this is actually the same face model used by Steve Meister back in the day when he was playtesting Morrowind. The character was a mage but also used a claymore. He wore Daedric armor and was primarily focused on getting gold despite the means. In an interview early on, Meister said, quote, "I used the test construction set primarily to test the magic system. I couldn't resist adding a few, shall we say, exaggerated spells, such as a ranged fire damage spell with a 2-kilometer radius that I named I Am Become Death. I always love fun details like this. I'll speak more directly on Morrowind's taverns shortly, but first we have to cover the final location." As if Telvanni structures weren't already unique by way of their construction, the town of Voss is even more so. It combines the rigid geometric structures of old Valathi strongholds with the modern twisting hyphae of fungal architecture. There isn't much to do or say in this town, so I must admit I knew very little about it when I arrived. The Vero Trade House sits on the water, up a twisting strand of stairs. Interestingly, this small tavern is owned by a husband and wife, Berkanius and Faris Vero. It has multiple floors with tables at which to drink and dine, and the publicans offer more than enough fuel for that fire. Still, as there's little reason to visit Voss, they don't see much business other than the errant traveling salesperson. As such, the tables are usually empty, though evidence of their previous use does remain. Perhaps the owners leave these bottles like this to convince others that people do visit. Maybe they even did it themselves. On the uppermost floor was a table full of booze and some storage for various ingredients. During my visit, a drunk wood elf stood on this floor, hanging around a planter of violet copperness which glowed blue, a light source of their own right. It was very unfortunate to discover then that the quote-unquote room I had rented was simply a bed on the other side of this thin partition. Delaying my rest long enough for the Bosmer to leave, I began wondering about the place, until I found myself in a storage room reading a shipping label. It seemed the owners ordered a lot of cheese, and just as I had finished reading that log, I felt a nibbling at my boot. A giant rat was there below me, no doubt summoned by the smell of Gouda. Leaving him to his business, I went upstairs and tried to sleep. For tomorrow, I was headed to the Imperial province of Cyrodiil. Morrowind's taverns were something I never really needed to visit. The law against sleeping in the open or in owned beds was somewhat skirted by the ability to sneak around or move into the wilderness, and so oftentimes I would rest that way to level up. Though once I got older and better understood the game, I would sleep at guild halls. That or I would kill someone and take their home. For the many Morrowind fans out there, you've probably done this more than once, but to others, fun fact. This will actually remove ownership of the bed so the player can sleep there without worry. Either that or it transfers ownership to the player. It makes sense both lore and gameplay wise, but it's still kind of odd to think about. Anyway, the inns of Morrowind are quite cool. Most of them are highly varied from one another, and there are small stories in them such as with the Aldskar Inn customers, or the meeting of a Nasi in Halfway Tavern. They serve defined quests and even lead to one of the best armor pieces in the game, the Daedric Face of God, if you explore a little more in Imbioff's cave adventure. I know I'll always seek them out in future playthroughs just for a little more immersion. Their design is often realistic and homey, and the knocked over bottles and chairs are clearly there to give life to an otherwise limited game engine. This venture took me into so many places that I honestly could not remember if I'd ever been to all of them, and I've been playing this game since it released for Xbox in 2003. Either way, I really love diving into Morrowind and learning more about it, even failing at Bethesda's attempt to add interactability to 8 plates post-launch. As mentioned, we will not be comparing different games to one another on most cases, as that's simply not fair, especially seeing as how I will luckily be able to use Oblivion Remastered for our next segment. And with all that said, let's dive into my adventures in Cyrodiil. Every time I return to Cyrodiil, it feels different, maybe more vibrant compared to the common styles of my home to the east. Something about this time felt very different though, perhaps it's just my imagination. Cyrodiil, as you know, is the capital province of the Empire. If Vivec was seen as a hub for commerce and travel, the Imperial City is the absolute center. Its shape conveys a wheel to me, not unlike the spokes of a caravanner's wagon. As a result of booming business, this province has more taverns than Morrowind or Skyrim, almost combined. In total, by my guidelines, there are 34 inns at which one can eat, drink, and rest. And sometimes more. In the short 6-year span between here and my native time in Morrowind, there have been further restrictions on loitering. It was becoming a nuisance since people were standing around shops waiting for them to open so that they could sell tons of loot. The people have also realized that sleeping in nature, using rocks as pillows and twigs as blankets, is not conducive to a good night's rest. A tent is different, mind you, but not everyone carries these. This creates even more reason for resting at a tavern, hence the increased number as compared to the other provinces. Much like in Morrowind, not all are created equal. In fact, Cyrodiil's inns by far have the most disparity between values of purchase. Without further ado, let us explore my findings in detail. North-northwest on a hill high above the Imperial City is the first inn I visited within the region. Although it wouldn't seem it, I am primarily an introvert. I mentally worked myself up to begin speaking to the people of what seemed to be a small village. Imagine my surprise when there was no one to talk to. Strangely enough, this bolstered my confidence. I knocked on a few doors, but no one answered. I swore I heard sheep, so there must have been someone tending to them, but alas, I saw not a single person nor ungulate. Even the farm seemed to be tending to itself, though that may have been my tired mind from the days of travel from Vvardenfell to mainland, and mainland to the Imperial Province. But just then I recalled what I'd heard when looking this place up. I was buying provisions in the city when someone mentioned a haunted inn. Up on the hill, they said. I walked into the tavern and saw bottles hovering in midair. I never ran so fast in my life. Being of Dunmerry descent, I of course have no fear of spirits. We often commune with our ancestors for counsel, and the utmost respect is placed upon our ancient burials for this and many other reasons. In front of me could have been a ghost, but that didn't feel quite right. Suddenly, a voice called out to me. It came from a man known as Dirham Serethi. He explained that they weren't dead, not at all, but instead had been turned invisible. There was a suspect, he said, a mage that worked out of the nearby Fort Caractacus. Perhaps he would know how to undo this mess. I offered to speak with him if I could find him in return for a short visit to the inn. Serethi obliged, and there began my experience with the inn proper. First, I must say, there are few greater places in the province to place an inn. It has a wonderful view of the Imperial City and Lake Rumere. On either side are tall trees giving a comfortably surrounded atmosphere. The building itself could have used some work, though I'm sure it's difficult to hire a roofer when everyone thinks you're a ghost. Serethi said this invisibility problem had been going on for weeks, but it takes longer than that for storms and winds to batter a rooftop so harshly. There were large patches of shingles missing here and there, along with moss growing in and between the grooves. Exposed wood could allow rain to seep in, which would only exacerbate these issues. There was clear signage up front with a crescent moon and stars. This would be a common symbol in the province, as we will learn further in the study. Moving inside, I was met with a small but comfortable room. There was a roaring fire that mystically sent exhaust through stone itself, as there was no chamber through which it could exit. Some care could have been taken to sweep up the ashes, though. The bar was clean with only a few mugs out. It seemed the tavern keeps were entertaining themselves, as the place had clearly not seen business since this magical mishap. Even their wine supply was running low as no one could order anything. Regardless of these issues, they still set tables and prepared food, including an entire loaf of bread I was given. It was a bit stale, but you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Decoration was sparse, but there was a painting by the Leviathan family on the wall. There was also a great green tapestry on the way to the bedrooms, which left much to be desired. Still, there was a pillow and blanket, as well as a dresser to store things in. And better yet, this was a free stay. In terms of gold, not time. There was a glaring lack of doors though, which does sour things. To hold up my end of the deal, I geared up and made my way down the hill toward the fort. Scouting around, I saw no hint of any person nor creature. This made sense once I met the perpetrator, of course, as he had accidentally turned himself and everything around him invisible. This seemed but a minor surprise to him, and after some conversation, he offered me a scroll to reverse the effects of the mistake. Following instructions, I read it in the center of town. Standing near the pumpkins, I read each word loud and clear. Suddenly, the people of Ayleswell were there in front of me. Shigol was clearly very thankful, as was Dirham. His sisters, on the other hand, seemed to have as much disdain for me as they did Ankatar, the wizard who caused all this. Either way, I held up my end of the bargain and was thanked dearly by Dirham. He offered me a free room anytime I visited, which was quite nice, though due to the condition of the room, I'm not sure I'll feel sleepy the next time I chance by. In the southwest region of the Gold Coast sits the city of Anvil. I always relish the times I get to visit, as this place is brimming with the air of adventure. Boats on shore, some headed toward lands unknown, birds squawking as they hunt crabs on the beach. It always fills me with energy. Even the doors feel the effects of the sea, with copper elements having oxidized over time. My destination here was the tavern known as the Count's Arms. According to locals, it was the best inn nearby. Wrought in strong stone, the building was formidable, as though a challenger to the others down the street. There were great brick pillars, curved banisters, and the roof was made of Spanish tiles. What a span is, I do not claim to understand. Perhaps it's a location known only to the sailors. The lanterns had just been lit when I made my way to the inn. The interior was spacious but very dim. In fact, only one of 2 red candles was blazing. Thankfully, a tall candelabra shone through the entrance so I didn't trip over the big red rug, which did lose detail in the low light. The central hall was supported by large stone pillars and the walls were sparingly decorated, with most of the beauty coming from the arched brickwork. There was a warm fire started in the corner furnace, nearby which was a carafe of wine and seating arrangements. Even the chairs were intricately carved, matching the gorgeous blue rug and these floral tiles that appeared every 2 or 3 sets upon the ground. In truth, it took me a few minutes of warming by the fire before I finally started to look at the place with a scrutinous mind. In an opposite corner was a table laid with apples, tomatoes, bread, leeks, carrots, and more. It's unclear who the feast was set for, but it seems this person didn't eat meat. I can say for certain that it was no green-packed Bosmer. The bar at the back was quite dark, with no light but a single candle on the counter. They displayed a few bottles of warm beer, as well as a wine rack adjacent. Part of me wanted to use one of the beautifully crafted mugs, but I was far too tired to stay up chatting. Regardless, the publican, Wilbur, asked me to enjoy some cooked potatoes and wine, then stared at me for an uncomfortably long period before checking if I enjoyed the meal. What was I to say other than yes? On the side of the inn was a small reading and relaxation room, which was quite nice. This was nothing compared to the bedroom, however. Paying the 25 gold necessary, I made my way upstairs. As soon as I entered the upper floor, I found a note that explained they only wash the beds after every 3 customers, no matter how soiled, which can definitely go 2 ways. I tried my best to put this out of my mind, walking through the beautiful hall, not helped in the least by the neglected candles on either side of my room, which made up for any negatives instantly. There was a table full of food, a bottle of wine, and fresh cut flowers. Storage was ample in the form of a full dresser along the western wall. Just below a set of large windows was the bed, crimson and gold. It was more luxurious than mine at home in Pelagiad, that's for sure. The windows themselves were a bit dirty and could have used a wash. The paint was chipping in spots, but that's to be expected over time. Overall, this room felt incredibly unique from the others I had visited. As I left the next morning, I came across a musician, the famous writer Quillweave, and a nervous young man who randomly offered me a house. Velwyn explained that he wanted to sell it fast and move on. I was definitely not in the market, and there was a shifty feeling to the whole thing. Why would he sell it so cheaply, and why did he seem so frantic? Either way, I passed on the opportunity and planned my next trip. The stay at the Count's Arms was great. Even with Wilbur being a bit odd, I give this place 5 stars. Just north of Anvil proper, up a hill of swaying golden grass and aloe, is the Brina Cross Inn. This location serves as a very useful rest stop between Anvil and Kvatch. It also served as a great location for me to make some health and fatigue potions from the native plants of the region. The trek up the hill was slow and tiring, and I needed full energy if I was going to review the place properly. The first thing of note about the inn is the thatched straw ceiling. I supposed it was made from whatever the nearby horse couldn't finish. And other than straw, there were some small garden sections of grapes, tomatoes, strawberries, and corn. It seemed they made their own wine here, as there was also a mashing bucket nearby. I always enjoy self-sufficiency and sustainability in business. Resisting the urge to pet the horse, I made my way inside. The interior was very dark, save for the roaring fire, which also cooked meat for visitors. Only a couple other people were staying, it seemed, but there were tables and chairs for plenty. Storage was neat and tidy, as were the tables set with lots of dishware and vegetables. This was a great feat considering only the publican worked here, taking care of the entire place. I spoke to Christoph about renting a room. It was an easy 10 gold to stay, and so I took it. Upstairs was a bit less organized. Random dishes lined the brick wall, and the upper hall was rather dimly lit. Still, guided by the moonlight, I was able to find my room and unlock the door. It contained a rather shabby bed, a worn wooden table, a single candle, and a couple paintings by Lythandus. I left in the morning with sunlight pouring in, thankful for the windows. And of course, as I left, I had to pet the horse. Overall, it was a decent stay with decent food. There were no major problems other than a rather dilapidated bed, which is pretty important. Since the wine was locally made, things were generally tidy, and the proprietor was kind. I'll give this place a solid 3 stars. Even as an alchemist and mycologist myself, the swampy regions of Blackwood are a difficult sell. There are poisonous animals, very large mosquitoes, and the mud is sure to stick with your boots for a long time after you've left. Same goes for the smell. But if you find yourself here and in need of a stay, you would do just fine to stay at the Drunken Dragon Inn. It follows the Imperial build we spoke of last, as well as what we'll see commonly throughout our study of Cyrodiil. The sign, although somewhat difficult to see in the ever-present rains of the region, depicts a robust dragon gripping a drinking horn, something I quite enjoyed. Just outside the inn was a fenced-in well, alongside some broken crates and other general debris. At first I felt nervous about how the interior would look, but then, considering the weathering effects of consistent rainfall and humidity, I began to feel worse for the owner. Andreas Dukranus was a very nice fellow, upbeat despite the difficulty of running such a place. Even the guard resting here was quite grim in mood. He offered a room for 20 gold, which may seem a bit much compared to the clean establishments we've visited. However, he had a decent selection of wine and did not get enough business to charge cheaper prices. I accepted and began jotting these notes down about the inn. First, the fire was just as nice as the last place. The floor was open and spacious, and food was at the ready. However, lighting was very poor, and the food was scattered a bit haphazardly across the tables. It didn't seem to affect the guard, as he was consistently putting away so much alcohol you might have thought the flagon was bottomless. As I took in more details, I felt even worse for the owner. His own bed was simply a mat on the floor behind the bar, the cold of the stone at his back every night. I asked if I could retrieve some matches for him downstairs, with an admitted ulterior motive. I went down to find but a few matches, drenched from leaks in the ceiling. Worse than that, though, were the roaches crawling among all the food storage, some of which, I should add, were left completely open and unprotected. I brought him what there was and went upstairs to find my room. Down a short, barren hall, I found and reached the door. It was as if I suddenly entered a different inn entirely. The bed had emerald sheets that were fairly clean, matching a tapestry on the wall. Below was a rug that looked good as new, a dresser for storage, and a writing desk at which I finished taking these notes. I slept that night better than the publican probably had in his entire time of owning the place. I did feel very bad for him and his misfortune here in Blackwood. However, there were a few things he could stand to fix. I truly wish I could review this inn better, but speaking in a strictly objective sense, I can only give this place 2 stars, as I'm sure you can imagine why. A village like Bleaker's Way is a rare one. It's comprised of Dunmer and Nordic peoples, 2 races that have not always gotten along, as many of us know. But here, things are just fine. I must say, apart from its location, far uphill and north of the Imperial City, this would be a wonderful place to live. There's a tavern here called the Goodwill Inn. This is a perfect name, seeing as how there is goodwill between both races regardless of troubled past relationships. It also had steel blue interlomas just outside, which I left in place for their beauty. When I stepped inside, I noticed a couple things. First, it was pretty much empty. Second, there was a small mess at the primary table and many bugs flitting around the candle. Apart from that and the occasional spider web, this place was kept in decent shape. Some kegs of alcohol were located upstairs, a strange choice as these were both heavy and would also be difficult to monitor if you were the publican, who must be watching the doors and serving customers. Perhaps the most unique and shocking feature of this inn, though, was the manner in which people slept. Up in the attic was a large open room where the floor was simply made of crisscrossed boards in varying degrees of disrepair. Every step made a loud creak, and the boards below me made every thread at folding in. Further, the beds themselves were very dirty. The pillows were torn and ripped, same goes for the blankets. Kirsten was very kind as a publican and offered me any bed upstairs for free. I suppose that, if there were no charge at all, it would be hard for me to be disappointed. Beggars can't be choosers, some say. In total, because of the general state of the building, its placement within a gentle town, the free board, and the kindness of the people there, I decided to give it a 3-star rating. This next location was an odd one. I would say unique, but due to the behaviors of some of the people there, I think odd is a more apt choice. The town of Border Watch is roughly southwest of the Drunken Dragon and northwest of Onyx Caverns. Here live 8 Khajiit and no other people. They're relatively secretive, not sharing much other than with themselves. I never felt disliked, but I certainly felt slightly unwelcome as I entered town. My destination, the Border Watch Inn, sat on the highest level of the clearing. It was the only business there, surrounded by 5 houses and smaller fenced-in areas for sheep and farming. It seemed this place was also fully self-sufficient. The inn was a bit dirty on the outside, with mold and moss growing all over the place. Shingles were splintered, askew, or otherwise completely missing. Much like with the Drunken Dragon Inn, we can chalk most of this up to the weather patterns of the region. I entered the place totally unsure of what I would find. As soon as I took a seat for preliminary notes, a group of other Khajiit came through almost as if to watch me. Then, one of them, a man by the name of Rabasa, sat down at my table, tossing many dishes, my drink, and my food onto the floor. No one in the entire establishment reacted with any surprise. When I spoke to him, he simply told me of the difference between different Imperials, then began to chug a suspicious beverage I could not discern. Not wanting to be rude, I simply let him drink as I took more notes on the situation. The 2 Khajiit behind us left then, leaving the tables of the open room quite empty. There were kegs of drinks, barrels of food, and dirty rugs on the floor. I wrote down these descriptions and looked up to find Rabasa gone. Eventually, I went back to the bar to speak with Sathasa. She was very kind and helpful, but the shelves behind her were somewhat disheveled. Much like Andreas of the Drunken Dragon, she slept on the floor, allowing her customers to use the only rooms with beds. Before I could ask about the price of a room, she told me of her unique cheese collection. One of these, the Olroy cheese, was apparently so unique and important that it had to be locked away. According to Sathasa, one smell of that aged food would bring rats for miles. I was curious as to why she would want to collect cheeses, perishable objects with potent odors, but I decided not to press the point. I finally rented a room for 10 gold, room number 1 of 2, which was clearly marked for ease of access. Although not surprised, I was definitely disappointed with the room. It was very dirty and with little light. Straw leaked out from the makeshift bed, stains lingered on the rug, and there was a mysterious, very concerning smell from the room that I could not source. For a moment, while Sathasa turned her back to clean, I peeked in the next room over. This one had a light, but also had a painting fallen to the floor, as well as an upturned table against the wall. I decided to cut my losses and move on from the place. I meant no offense to the people there, but I simply could not sleep in a room such as that. Still, I complimented Sathasa on her cheese collection before leaving back to the road. After our last study on the 9 Divines, one of you had a great perspective on the reason for why Mara's temples were always built in places of such ill repute, including those like Breville and Riften. According to this student, the temples of Mara exist in these places because they're most in need of love. Revisiting Breville, I can certainly agree with that. These locations need attention from the Empire, hope to get them through, and a deep cleaning infused with TLC. Perhaps this could start with the Lonely Suitor Lodge on the south end of town. Much like the other buildings in Breville, the lodge is very shabbily constructed. There are no shingles on the roof, only boards. The wood is torn apart in many places by storms. Windows are missing shutters on their doors and, in some cases, missing a door completely. This was also the first inn at which I could simply not see without a torch. The people here were comfortable in the deep darkness, so it startled them to say the least. I simply apologized and kept the thing lit. This main room was host to a bar in the center where the orc proprietor Bagram sold food and drink. On the counters were food, sometimes placed on dishes. Near the entrance was a very strangely shaped closet, but with a single chest inside. Within were some fighting materials. There was never an explanation given, as I never asked. Still, it was quite odd. At the back toward the fireplace was a well-trodden, often stained rug. The ladle used to spoon soup from the fireplace cooking pot was thrown to the floor. It was at that point I decided I wouldn't even chance the food at this establishment. I spoke to Bagram about renting a room. For 10 gold, it was a steep sell, and even he admitted it would not be a palace. Fair enough. Right he was. The room was musty with one painting on the wall, mold everywhere, a dresser for storage, and 2 dirty beds that were most likely crawling with bed bugs. I took my chances leaning against the wall near the door. This was for a few reasons. 1, I did not want to be bitten. 2, there wasn't as much mold by the door. And 3, I didn't trust the lock. I slept pitifully and woke in the early hours of the day, and since I had another inn to visit within the town, I walked across the bridge and took a small nap in the church pew under the watch of Mara's priests. Silverhome on the Water is an inn located near the entrance to town. It's one of the first things a person will see upon entering, and if they need to rest somewhere, this is probably the better choice over the lodge. Despite this, its interior is still rather filthy by nature of it being a poorly cared for town. The proprietor, Gilgondrin, does his best with what he's given. Unfortunately, this includes fungal infections of the walls and ample supplies of dust. The bar on the first floor is clean and nice, very out of place among the rest of the furniture. There's more than enough wine to sate an appetite, and a few low stools around the counter to eat and drink at. There's also an open room nearby with a couple well-lit tables, some tapestries, and storage. Again, the publican is making do with what he can, and this includes operating space. I'd heard rumors through town that he never wanted the place, that it was thrust upon him as a familial inheritance. It can be heard in his tone and seen in his eyes. And yet, there's always food on the table and drink in hand. Although this lot in life is not what one would call enjoyable, he does take it in stride. We should all be so noble. When I spoke to him, I was surprised to find him well versed in local legends. He spoke of a ghost wandering the coastline. Although I hadn't the time to search for this spirit, I strangely believed Gilgondrin's story. He would gain no benefit from lying to me. After that discussion, I rented a room on the second floor, grabbed some sweet rolls, and went on my way. The stairway was somewhat creepy, and the doors were made of horizontal rows of boards. A very webbed-over chandelier lit the upper end, which was not unlocked for visitors. When I found my room, I was blown away. It may have been the most disgusting I had seen yet. The walls were molded, the wood rotting, and the bedsheets all but torn up. Still, I saw no evidence of bugs, and I had gotten very little sleep during my time in Breville. Against my wishes, my heavy eyelids bade me obey. I slept on top of the covers that night, fretting about whatever diseases I may wake to. In the morning, I spoke to Gilgondrin and others about the ghostly man they had mentioned before. I felt intrigued by the rumor, and it seemed everyone in town had seen him. The Forlorn Watchman, he was called. I decided I would keep an eye out if I ever journeyed south again, for I may just see his ghostly visage patrolling the shore. Across the Niben Bay in the Valley region lies one of the most idyllic cottage inns I have ever visited. I crossed the old bridge at once, then found myself relaxing in the small garden. Here and there were flowers mixed with the occasional mushroom. Aptly named, this place was called the Imperial Bridge Inn. It was just off the valley extension, after all. I can imagine how many times someone sat on the bench out front, watching caravans, waiting for the sunrise, and so on. The interior of the place was familiar in a funny way. There was a mug on the floor, a crooked painting, and red floral tapestries. The publican was also a Dunmer woman. This reminded me of places back in Morrowind, and I would be lying if I said I didn't get a little homesick. After speaking with Davila momentarily, I bought some provisions and rented a room. It was 10 gold for any bed on the top floor. I was also warned to watch my step. I groaned interiorly, knowing what that meant. Just past the dining table set up on the second floor was a door leading to the stairs, and of course I came to see exactly what I had expected. The attic was full of dirty beds. There was barely any light there either, and it would be near impossible to see after dark when the windows weren't shining through. This may have been even worse than the Goodwill Inn. One saving grace was that there were multiple books to read whenever I wanted. I did glance through them while bored toward the end of the night, but this visit was not yet over. As I stepped downstairs to buy a drink, hoping it would help me sleep, I came across an Altmer by the name of Lithnilian. He was quite old and told me there were some research notes he had lost in a cave. Apparently he had been looking into Welkin stones, those same mineral structures we've discussed on other occasions. He told me there were Welkin stones growing from the ground in Bramble Point Cave. This was an academic venture I had to be part of. For all we had known, they fell from the sky in ancient times. Now it seemed we would uncover this as a lie told by the Aliads. And so it was that I woke up the next day and journeyed to the cave. After dispatching numerous imps and rats, I found myself standing face to face with green stalagmites. No, these were Welkin crystals. Just nearby were Lithnilian's notes, and there was some small part of me that said I should take one of the stones as well. However, I beat back the urge and read his work journal instead. It seems he believed the Aelids had a deep understanding of how to grow the stones in any environment. I do admit they sometimes grow in cracks along old ruins, but could it not be that the stones were a natural formation already, and that their growth habits are simply exacerbated by magical activity? Meaning when one formation grows, it exudes energy that begets another? I'm no geologist, of course, but this was my theory. Regardless, Lithnilian was very surprised at my return and gave me some frost shield potions as a reward. This was fortuitous, as my next venture would take me to the snowy city of Bruma. Bruma is a city that blends both Imperial and Nordic cultures. This is due to its location along the base of the Jarl Mountains, which separate Cyrodiil and Skyrim. Nords are well known for their love of alcohol, namely mead and beer. It stands to reason then that there's a very nice tavern in town called the Jarl View, run by Hafid Hollowleg, a Nord traveler who came from just over the border. Shivering, I rose the steps toward the view, and when I found it, I noticed a few things. Like in Morrowind's Imperial and Nordic architectural collaborations, there was a lot of intricate wood carving. Wooden chains interlinked all across the supports of the roof structures. Pillars of trunks were carved to show geometric designs inlaid with spirals. I almost mistook the diamond in the center for the Imperial seal. Then of course there were small dragon heads cut into the carefully curved lengths of wood that served as the backbone of the building. The shingles were strong as well, with snow and ice building on top, clearly not getting through. As it seems this town was first created by Imperials, who then allowed Nords to settle, it's quite amazing to see how the newcomers were able to flex their impeccable carpentry. Many other locations in the region have displaced roof tiles and leaks within, but not here. The entrance hall was absolutely gorgeous. Lighting was low, with candles doing much of the work. They hung from wooden posts tightened by metal bands, each containing their own concentric designs. Cut flowers gave the place a sweet aroma. This would be no easy feat either, as they must have been picked far from this place and transported here. They could not have survived the climate without much dedication and attention. The dining room had many such flowers, as well as 2 chandeliers, the bar, a keg, and tables for those dining, drinking, or playing games. The rugs and tapestries were quite clean, and for a moment I was reminded of all I'd heard growing up about Nords, how they're rowdy, messy individuals who cannot keep their heads. Now, there are a couple people like that in town that we spoke of in the last study, but at this moment, especially since I had time to focus more on my surroundings, I realized that this place was better kept and with fewer messes than nearly any Dunmary tavern I visited back on Vardenfell. I looked out the frosted window, seeing ice melt had left it a bit streaked. However, as mentioned with the roofing, no water seemed to have leaked inside. Hollowleg's bar was scuffed up, with ring marks across several spots. I took this less as a mess and more of a sign of the place's success in business. And who could forget the roaring fire, topped with a trophy made by the owner himself? The fire, although seemingly small, still lit the whole room, giving everyone rosy cheeks, though that may have also been the mead. Through a door to the west was the kitchen, where one man spent all his time creating the meals that Hollowleg would serve to guests. He had his own room connected to it as well, where I may have snuck a peek at a note. It described the cleaning practices of the place which, compared to the last note I read in Anvil, gave me much more hope about my stay. For only 25 gold, I found myself in the most luxurious room I had ever stayed in within Cyrodiil. The furniture was maximum grade wood, strong and with deeply etched designs. Storage was plentiful, paintings lined the walls, and every rug or tapestry was clean and admirable. The bed itself was super comfortable, a combination of green and gold embroidery. I slept incredibly well that night. If you could not tell by the description alone, I'm inclined to speak plainly. 5 stars. Give Hafid Hollowleg your business should you ever find yourself in Bruma. Our next location is within the same town, but definitely less grand. Olav's Tap and Tack is situated right near the gate to Bruma, and one may be tempted to leave the cold air as soon as they arrive, but walk the few extra minutes north. I do not recommend this place. First, the thatched roof comes with all the same problems we've spoken of regarding other similar establishments in the province. Rain and wind sneak through, and even heat from a furnace will dissipate with ease. As soon as I stepped in, I nearly slipped. There's a rug directly next to the door for drying one's shoes, however it is never towel dried or managed in any way apparently. The main room is quite small and bare bones. The fire was appreciated but not as useful as it could have been due to the airy choice of ceiling. Then there was the food. Dishes were cracked and chipped, the food dry and unappetizing. I do understand when people are trying their best, but this was a bit ridiculous. It doesn't take much time to tidy things up a bit. Perhaps that's why all the smaller things were getting to me. Rugs were yanked this way and that, and there was no decoration to hide the water damage on the walls. The entryway is a slipping hazard, and some of the storage shelves were covered in webs so thick I could use them to weave better blankets than guests were offered. The room was, admittedly, much better than something you would find in Blackwood, but it was still dirty, with bedclothes in terrible condition, bare walls, a dirty floor, and no amenities, other than a table with no chair. Even worse were the rooms downstairs, where food, drinks, clothes, you name it, were thrown all about the place. At least Olav was honest about the room.
Remember, I didn't say it was clean. I said it was cheap.
The town of Cheydinhall contains perhaps the most beautiful exterior architecture and color schemes of the province. This is probably why Rythlithandis chose to live there. Interestingly, both of the town's taverns are directly across from one another. This is a fiercely competitive move, and I was interested to hear what each had to say about the other business. Beginning with the Cheydinhall Bridge Inn, we can look at some of the finer artistic decisions by the town. The primary colors of interest are white and purple, with the wood being stained through some secret means. This could have been done with crushed sea snails, but I'm hoping it's from some sort of fungal life I am not yet aware of, akin to the green stain fungus often found in oak trees. This fungus often finds its way into the wood through spores hitching a ride on certain wood-boring beetles. This could also be the case here, and someone in town is breeding an enclosure full of them. Either way, the purple wood is truly beautiful. It looks even better with native vines climbing the walls, adding a bit of lively green to the mix. This leads the eye into the diamond-patterned roof, made with scaled shingles of purple and black. When entering the building, I was met with a cozy fire in a quiet hall, the only sound being a crackle and the occasional footstep of Mariana Ancaria on the stone floor. The bar was off to the side, unassuming and simple. Directly across was one of a few tables, set with flowers and candles. Though it seems the candles are only lit to order, as many tables were placed in the dark corners of the room. Although Mariana started with a smile, I soon had the feeling I did not like the atmosphere of the place. She proclaims to only serve people of quality. I suppose I looked distinguished, or perhaps it was simply because I had the 40 gold, but she did rent me a room for the night. I have to say, the upstairs section was wonderful. There was a small conversation area near the windows that made for quite a pleasant view, though I couldn't shake the thought that conversations here were probably full of small talk and uppity discourse about people of lower class. The bedroom was the largest I'd seen yet in the province, and had wood furniture equaling that of the Gerald View. A long table sat in the room, so the renter could host friends or business partners. All of the dishes were silver, no exceptions. The bed was, of course, very regal. For my most expensive stay yet, I would not have accepted less. I will admit that the view waking up the next morning was quite enjoyable. Overall, this room was one of the best I'd stayed at, though the cost and exclusionary nature of business here definitely soured the experience. I could not give this a full 5 stars as a result. And as I left, I had the displeasure of meeting one of the regulars. He alone confirmed all my suspicions about the place. Entering the Newlands Lodge just across the way, I found an altogether more comfortable establishment. Its architecture was much the same as the Bridge Inn, including the spikes on the roof spines to keep birds from alighting and soiling the shingles. One big difference was that it had a full hollow tower as the entrance, the purpose of which was lost on me. The main hall had many seating areas, fresh-cut flowers, and wine racks along the wall. It was a bit messy, admittedly, but speaking to Dervera cleared that up for me. She was funny and told me that this place was intentionally wild. Making messes, having fights, etc. was all allowed. And still, everyone I saw inside was very calm, if not the most polite. I only paid 10 gold for the room too, so I did not expect it to be amazing. The food, however, was just fine. There were pumpkins, strawberries, and plenty booze to instigate one of the supposed fights that often occurred here. Making my way upstairs, I saw a clear, open space with doors on all sides. 2 led to smaller rooms, where 1 led to my own for the night. As expected, it was somewhat lackluster. There was a bed, a dresser, and minor decorations. The bed sheets were not in good condition, but it would do for one night, I supposed. At least I had a room and a door, though Gilbert Germain seemed to think he could walk in whenever he wanted. One of my complaints about the room is that it shared an open ceiling with the next one over, so noise traveled well and clearly. This removed a bit of privacy and also made it a bit noisy when I was trying to sleep, especially considering a small brawl did occur that night while I tossed and turned. I was warned about this in advance though, and something about Dervera's personality was charming enough for me to lay these complaints aside. Coral is home to one of the finest bookstores I've ever been to, called Renoir's, and as we've discussed before, the Oak Enclosure sits just nearby. However, before I have the pleasure to speak on Talisman's fine business, we must first discuss one further down the road called the Grey Mare. As far as I could tell, the place was closed, and perhaps even abandoned. The signage outside was nice, but there were no shingles on the awning whatsoever. Moss was becoming the prevailing tile work. As I waited outside a while, not a single customer came or went. I knocked on the door very cautiously. I was surprised to see an interior that was at least somewhat organized, and adding to that, there were a couple other customers here. They stood just past the leaking kegs, which spilled wine onto the floor. The proprietor, Imfrid, kept her bed just behind the bar, and the table was open for business. For 10 gold, I was given a room on the upper floor. It was barely better than Ayleswell. Honestly, the only point it gets ahead of that tavern is that there was a door. The bed was still just a mat on the ground with a dusty pillow, and there were no lights in the room whatsoever. It would be very dangerous to rest here if you had enemies. At least there was a lockable chest next to the bed to protect your valuables while you defended yourself. Speaking to the others downstairs, I learned of 2 stories. The first concerned Reynold Germain, whose name and likeness seemed very familiar to me. Apparently people were mixing him up with someone else, and for some reason I was inclined to feel the same way. Despite the intrigue, I decided these could just have been the ramblings of a drunk man, so I turned and spoke to the other customer. This man was named Valus Odile, and it turned out his farm was being continuously raided by goblins. Being an older man, he feared he would not be up to the challenge of taking them out. He asked me to assist his family in ridding them of this problem, and feeling a bit restless, I decided I would stretch my legs and aid them. Just outside the city proper were his sons. I spoke to Rallis, who told me the guards were doing nothing to help. Although I understood many people were nerve-wracked after the death of the Emperor, it didn't do to just freeze at the first signs of trouble. This further convinced me of the need to help. He and his brother led me to the farm, where we drew our blades and sat in wait for the creatures to arrive. It didn't take long before many goblins started cresting the hill. I slew each one with but a swing of my glass shortsword, leaving a large pile of bodies to deal with. These 2 were no fighters, and they said as much, so I did my best to get between them and any of the vile creatures. And just like that, they were gone. I hoped the family would be free of them, but told them if they ever wanted to reach me, they could send a letter to my home in Pelagiad, in case there were ever signs of a larger force brewing. I've been looking forward to talking about the Oak Enclosure ever since I first began writing notes down about my tavern experiences. This business is housed within large yellowed walls, each with clear windows placed within. The roof was, albeit a bit worn as the rest, stylistic in a very imperial sense. It matched the rest of the buildings and businesses here to a T, including the spike at the top of the entry door's cap. I would like to clear out any and all rumors about there being any problem with Talisma's Tavern. I've heard some say odd things about it, as if it were haunted, or even the headquarters for the plotting of dastardly deeds. I hate to say it, but part of me believes the people are simply bigoted toward those like Talisma and her friend across the way, the Argonian Seat Neas. As any visitor would find upon entering, the Oak Enclosure is one of the cleanest and nicest taverns to exist in Tamriel. There's much room for visitors to eat, drink, dance, and whatever they like. A fire promises warmth for any who need it, and the chandelier is lit when large parties come to the lounge area. Food is placed out each day and rotated according to the speed of business. The bar in the center is an immaculate piece of craftsmanship. Although primarily a standing counter, there are a couple chairs and more than enough drinks for any to partake. As her bar sees a lot of traffic, she keeps many clean silver mugs below the counter, ready to go at a moment's notice. Just behind the bar is a keg mounted and raised above the ground. On it is a sign displaying the specialty of the day, which happened to be aged spicy lager upon my arrival. If you ever happen to see the same thing written on your visit, I implore you to try it. It was unlike anything I'd ever tasted. Talisma, being modest despite the success of her business, doesn't even have a room. She sleeps right behind the counter, her days dedicated to the customer. Just upstairs is another suite of tables and chairs, as well as plenty books to read which can be borrowed as long as you have a room rented. This was how I first learned of Alessia Audis, the dreaded author who berates any and all people she disagrees with. Were it not for the chance finding of her Guide to Coral, I never would have been able to join the vocal cause against her. Above the doorway to the resting hall is a sign that reads, "To achieve the impossible dream, try going to sleep." At first, I was confused as to how to read it. Now I chuckle every time I pass it, for I know exactly what it means. There are other funny signs scattered about, such as this one which reads, "Conversation is the enemy of good wine and food." Talisma was very kind and welcoming, and her beds were the same exact price as the Grey Mare. It was almost too good to be true. My room upstairs was set just as before, with a decent, clean bed, lots of storage space and furniture, and clean open windows to light the place. There were pretty cups to drink from, and the smell of the flowers was enough to distract me from the black mold that seems to plague every building in the province. Overall, this location is an easy 5 stars. Back when I was at the Lonely Suitor Lodge in Braville, a hooded man beckoned me to a table beside the fire. I was hesitant, of course, but there was something about him I needed to know. He told me his name was Norden Ramsey. Then he slid me a note. It read as follows: "I've been watching you. You tread a dangerous path and I suggest you stop now. Soon you'll find yourself at the village of Hackdirt. This place is an anomaly, and one you may not survive. Rate it 0 stars and move on, or you will find yourself in Oblivion." I looked up to question the man, but he would not reply. He simply pointed toward the door and told me to go. As I left, he stayed behind, watching me. I never did see his face. On the map was a location with the word "Avoid" written in all caps scrawled next to it. Just this once, I decided I'd do something dangerous. This is what led me to the decrepit, destroyed, and worrisome location of Hackdirt. It seemed as though this place was ravaged by a fire. There were very few people here as well, and many were dressed in rags or animal skins. Of the few establishments still standing, all the named ones were marked as being owned by Moslin. This also went for the inn. The interior was very, very scattered. Objects were thrown about the place, everything was dirty, and it looked completely abandoned, as if I was the first one to enter the tavern in years. A gruff man at the counter charged me 30 gold just to look at the inn room. He watched silently as I entered the top floor, checking around to see what the deal was. There were more knocked down pieces of furniture, though most candles were lit. The blankets and pillows were very dirty, and the tapestries looked as though horses had run through mud and trod upon them. I had the feeling that if I fell asleep here, I would never wake up. As I walked back downstairs, the man was gone. A woman was standing in the room, making no sound. In fact, the only sounds I heard beyond my own footsteps was the wind rattling the windows. I sat with my back to the wall in order to take notes, weary of what should happen otherwise. After I gathered my thoughts, I stepped outside only to be questioned by the townspeople. One told me they didn't welcome strangers. Another told me of a fire outsiders had started, apparently trying to wipe them out. That explained the state of the place, but not the eerie feeling of the people saying they would again reach the glory days very soon. The last person I spoke to was especially unnerving and threatened to me with the Brethren, telling me I could die if I asked any more questions. I decided to eat the 30 gold and just be on my way. I felt their eyes watching me all the while, not unlike those of Norden back in Breville. Eventually the road led back to civilized areas, taking me north of the Imperial City once more. An hour's travel east from Ayleswell sits the Roxy Inn, run by a woman named Malene. This was a breath of fresh air. The tavern was within a reasonable distance of the city, and guards patrolled the road often. Although the build of the place was quite similar to other low-grade locations, I felt at ease as I walked near. Someone else must have trusted the place too, as they left their horse unleashed just outside the door. The spewing chimney promised comfort within, and the view nearby was simply wonderful, green as far as the eye could see. There was an idyllic hill just nearby, and I could imagine myself reading just against the rock. What I did not expect was that this would be the most populated inn I had visited in the province. The noise of conversation was so loud I couldn't even think straight. Luckily, a guard was present, making sure no fights occurred. The main hall was quite clean despite the heavy foot traffic, and I had room to sit at the table and enjoy a beer or two. There was plenty to eat, and Malene trusted people well enough not to steal it, seeing as how she kept it near the door. For these reasons, I felt very safe here, even though I knew the bed was not going to be worth much. At the very least, it was decorated, had a light, and had some storage. I did end up taking the mattress and flipping it though, as it was angled away from the door. Ultimately, I did not even mind the crooked paintings. I just felt safe from the horrors of whatever was occurring back in Hackdirt. This was only 10 gold after all, and when Malene asked me to go kill a necromancer, I told her I'd think on it. The life of an adventurer takes you to beautiful, sometimes strange places. This was the case with Fairgill Inn, a lodge in the middle of the woods just near a shrine to Zenithar. Unlike others in the same architectural style that we visited, this building was in great shape. Care had clearly gone into maintaining the brickwork and also the yard of the establishment. By the time I reached it, the ground was dappled in light, weaving its way through the trees. My legs began to feel heavy from the walk, but I knew I would soon sleep well. The first thing one sees at the Fairgill Inn is the bar, a nice wooden piece with a basket of beer front and center. Alex Lincolia, who I thought was the publican since he kept stepping behind the bar, told me that land dregs were sometimes called billies. I had never heard that before. Sajira, a Khajiit, told me the publican was busy at the moment. She then asked me to find her jumbo potatoes, which had apparently been stolen. This was a bit humorous to me, I admit, and what I did not plan on doing next was fighting a giant ogre in the woods. He fell easy enough with one strong shield bash to the head. And just as Sajira had said, he was in possession of her potatoes. She was very happy to reclaim them, and she ended up giving me the first batch of potato bread she had made recently. After a couple bites, I couldn't stop myself. It was pretty good. But enough about potatoes and billies. As the publican, also a Khajiit apparently, was nowhere to be found, I simply helped myself to a beer, or two. Then I continued around the place, noting various things. For one, the cleanliness of the exterior was not halted past the doorway. This was a nice place to be certain. Storage was neat and tidy, food was served in clean dishes, and candles were lit all about the place. I stared into a small crystal ball while Sajira drank and spoke to me about potatoes. Looking just over the bar, I noticed the owner slept on the floor near the fire, yet there was a perfectly workable bedroom just downstairs. This did confuse me. Maybe Alex slept on the mat while the owner slept down there. I walked upstairs past the cooking soup and into a bare hallway before finally knocking on a door to see what would happen. I guess the owner had just been tidying up the room for the next person when I got there. Her name was Ibuki, and for 10 gold she gave me the key to the room. She insisted on hanging out while I surveyed it. I have to say, it was not fantastic, but the beer helped, and I was happy to chat with Sajira downstairs about her fledgling potato bread business. With a name like the Inn of Ill Omen, you would expect something terribly wrong to happen there. This was not the case at all, at least for my visit, unless you count a sad room as something of an omen. The exterior was quite plain and in need of renovation. The sign, a crow painted above a hanging ring of metal, was fitting for the name, but I could also see how this would dissuade people from visiting. Entering the place, I found a very dark room with things all over the floor. Mannheim, the owner, was nice enough. He offered the room for 10 gold, and I begrudgingly agreed. I did not expect much, but perhaps a little more than a single bedroll facing the wall. After speaking a bit more to him, I did learn that he was a fence for stolen goods. This would be beneficial to members of the Thieves Guild, though one does not necessarily need to be a member to make a sale. They simply have to be versed in mercantile. On my way out, I happened upon Minerva, who felt the need to tell me that Mannheim seemed to have feelings for her. She was very flirtatious in her drunken state, and I decided it would be best for me to leave before anything strange should happen. Walking through the Imperial City felt quite nice compared to all the wild adventures I had gotten into. It was a reprieve from lawless wilds and shady inn rooms. Every business here would have to be decent at least, as it would not survive otherwise. The first tavern I visited in the city was the King and Queen Tavern of the Elven Gardens. Capped with blue shingles in a small tower, it was very easy to spot. I knew this place would be comfortable the moment I stepped in. There weren't any other visitors, but I told myself this was because of the time of day. People would be out shopping or working until dark. I waved at the innkeeper, a man named Lay, who told me to sit down and relax. He didn't have to tell me twice. I pulled out my quill and began noting down some of my previous experiences, as well as small points about the KQ Tavern. There were green, expensive-looking chairs, and the dishes were all made of steel or iron. The dining hall was spacious, and although a bit messy, this was quaint compared to the rooms in which I had slept, where snuff legends were born. Here, there was more beer than I could ever drink in one night, fresh apples, all manner of vegetables, etc. It's somewhat rude to compare the other locations to those in the richest city of the Empire, but it cannot be helped. There's a reason I've been rating places based upon a number of factors, which include the kindness of the people there. If these weren't taken into account, every stop in the Imperial City would be a 5-star shoo-in. Lay, like many in town, is so sure of the safety of his establishment that he keeps his ledger box right there on the bar. Behind the counter were racks of beer, shining and inviting, but of course I needed to scope out the bedroom. Because of all my other experiences with 10 gold inns, including the Inn of Ill Sleep quality, I momentarily stressed at the words. I walked upstairs to find a very pleasant hall with clean windows and flowers. The single brazier was more than enough to light the entire hall, that way I could admire the brickwork as I found my room. It was the second on the right, and it did not disappoint me one bit. This room was very clean, with paintings of the city and nearby chapels to admire. Intricate blue tapestries hung on the walls, the likes of which I had never seen. There were floral patterns and rings, with roses blooming from the center, surrounded by small white diamonds. Hanging from the ceiling was a chandelier that could be lit upon request, or with the aid of my innate magical ability to cast flame, but the candles below set the mood perfectly for a relaxed night to myself. While the bed was not the most luxurious I had seen, it was, in fact, an actual bed, and with clean sheets as a bonus. All said and done, the King and Queen Tavern is a worthwhile stay in the Imperial City. Almost an exact mirror of the King and Queen's exterior, Luther Broad's boarding house was playing a losing game. Although much nicer than many of the places we've discussed, as it still benefits from its placement and support of the Imperial City, the boarding house is much less fancy. For starters, it is much dirtier. Stains cover the rugs, splotches of unidentified black material cover the floor, food sits intentionally placed on the floor, etc. The lighting was quite bad, and for a moment I could not even tell that Luther Broad was present when I walked in. Although there are tables with decent setups and colorful dishes, it's hard to appreciate them when I feel as though I'm emulating the existence of a mole underground. The bar suffers the same fate, but is somewhat worse considering food is just thrust on the counter. It also doesn't help that, if Luther has a customer, he will stare directly at them with no chance of diversion. Perhaps this was his way of showing attention to the customer in order to make them feel acknowledged, but to me it felt like he was angry at me for entering the place. Things were in ample supply. That is one definite positive I can list. There were kegs full of beer and vegetables, mostly pumpkins, all over the place. One thing that made me feel slightly less comfortable about my time here was that Luther had his hammer slung on his back, ready to use at the first sign of trouble. I tried small talk, but he is more direct and to the point in his approach to commerce and perhaps combat. I went upstairs to check out my room. For 10 gold, it honestly wasn't terrible. It was certainly less clean, and I did wonder why there was a random chair along the wall. With that out of mind though, the room offered decent lighting, storage, and had Lythandus paintings in good condition. The bed was surprisingly clean, and the comforter was actually better than some of the more high-class locations I had visited. I really enjoyed the yellow floral design. It was clear that someone worked very hard on it. By the window was a very small table for dining alone or with another. The plate on top hung over the edge, and I wondered if this was simply an arrangement issue or if Luther should have bought a larger table. All in all, my stay wasn't terrible, but there are reasons I will probably not return. The market district is the heart of all trade in the Imperial City. Even other businesses across the province will direct you there for more specific or reliable finds. Since there are so many stores in this area, shopping can often take a long while. I often find myself spending a bit too long poring over Claudette's potions and ingredients at the Gilded Carafe, or gazing at the wonderful mushrooms displayed by Ogier. There are so many options to choose from, and haggling can take some time as well. Eventually you end up with a bag full of supplies and a sun hanging low. For adventurers like me, this means it's time to visit a tavern. Opportunistically placed is the Merchant's Inn, run by Velis Hosidius. Velis is very comfortable with clients, even allowing them to wander behind the bar. Everyone knows his face, and I do envy the many stories and secrets he's been told over time. Seeing as how it's always busy late at night, and Velis is always the social butterfly, it takes some time to pick up the many knocked over drinks and dishes. As soon as I entered, a dish slipped and fell at the back, but he was busy entertaining a customer and could not take care of it just then. The main hall, although in need of a gentle sweep, is spacious and accommodating. Fresh food is served at any hour, and most of the dishes can be trusted to be clean. I'm glad I arrived early in the day, that way I would have a chance to write notes about the place. It gets very loud after dark since so many people, even those who run shops and or live in the city, want to come say hello. The beds are 20 gold a night, no doubt due to the proximity of shops just outside. The hall upstairs is fairly nice, with good lighting and only mildly disheveled carpets. My room was nothing amazing, with the bed containing straw on the mattress and blankets that had not been washed in a couple days. This was pretty concerning, and I decided I would just rest atop the sheets. I did, however, get a nice meal to myself, so that was a bonus. Later, I noticed a note sitting on the writing desk. It was sent from one supposed lover to another. I felt bad for the person, as this was casually left behind. Either that or it was accidentally forgotten. In any case, I wondered how they were doing. All in all, the Merchant's Inn is simply a rest stop for those with business in the market district. Run by one person, servicing all sorts of people, I say this establishment does a fair job. If you think the market district can be expensive, don't bother trying to find a place to live in Talos Plaza. Some people, including myself, think it's far overblown. The cost for comfort and security is very high, and it even leaches into the nearby inn, the Tiber Septim Hotel. The interior of the place is quite large and somewhat barren. Decorations along the walls might be cursed to fall, adding some interest to the location, to the chagrin of Augusta Callida, of course. On either side of a long hall is an open seating area where one needs to carry a torch in order to see their friends. Despite all the fancy clutter and the prime location, business must be scarce since Augusta sleeps behind the counter like many other tavern keeps. Speaking with her, she was quite polite. She also sold me a copy of The Lusty Argonian Maid, which threw me for a loop. I guess you should never judge a book by its cover. I was prepared to dislike Augusta based on how I was spoken to by the other people in the area. Luckily, I found myself to be quite off base. For 40 gold, she offered me a room upstairs, as well as access to a full banquet hall at which I was the only current attendant. It really was beautiful, with more food than I could ever eat, lots of nice silver dishes, and a big long table at which plenty students could potentially join me in the future should we ever make a field trip to the city. I took in all the sights and scents of the table, and by the time I was finished eating, I needed to find a bed for a nap. My room was not the largest I've had, but it was neat, organized, and clean. There was trustworthy storage, potted flowers, well cared for paintings, and a freshly washed bed and rug. I didn't know if Augusta did all this herself or had assistants, but either way it was a nice break where I felt fully comfortable with diving under the covers to sleep. Even the hallways were beautiful. There was plenty of seating for visitors awaiting friends or family, pretty tapestries, and generally clean windows. To round things out, there was a tower meant for meetings or general conversational gatherings. I can imagine bringing some drinks up here to pass the time and speak of adventures come and gone. I'm happy to say that I had the wrong first impression of Augusta, and that I would visit this place again, no matter the stuffy personalities of the plaza's residents. I spent what felt like ages looking for the All Saints Inn. According to my maps, it was somewhere in the Temple District. After a while, someone recognized me as a foreigner and pointed me in the right direction. In the back corner of the district, hidden just out of the way of the road, was my quarry. The first thing I noticed about the place, aside from its poor location, was the lack of any food on the messy tables. In one corner there was food, but it seemed discolored from a distance. There was also a complete lack of windows, and so it was quite dark inside. The publican, Willett, was a nice man. I felt bad for him, as he dressed in clothes that were barely held together. Judging by the state of things, he couldn't afford to hire an assistant, and other people were also having trouble finding the place. He did seem to lack an idea of order, since every single table, including the bar between us, had toppled drinks or dishes across it. To me, it seemed like he just needed some help. After 1 hour and 15 nearly refused gold later, he thanked me for cleaning up and showed me my room downstairs. It was quite small, but the food there was fresh and the bed workable. Having spent some time in different inns, I felt okay offering opinions on how he could spruce the place up a bit. Without windows or money, things would be difficult. But if he could put more time into advertising in the other districts, as well as keeping things tidy, I think Willett could turn this from a 2-star to at least a 3, and perhaps even a 4 if he could get an assistant. On my last day within the Imperial City, rain began to fall. It was a very slow day where I could find no reasonable excuse to spend time outside, and so I followed my notes to the last public resting spot in the bounds of the city. I had heard tell of a boat floating in the docks with a house built atop it. I pictured something much larger, but this place, the bloated float, was both unique and cheap enough to garner my interest. The enjoyable gloom of the storm did much work to dull the colors of the place, but it still looked magnificent, like something out of a children's storybook. The sails blew in the wind, never to lead to open waters. There were also many nets hanging from the side, ostensibly to catch fish in the past. The red brick was fading, losing color over time. It would definitely need proper shingles to avoid further weathering from storms such as this. Still, it stood out immediately, and as I walked over, there was no doubt in my mind that this was the place. I entered to find the publican, Ormel, quite alone. It seemed that others would not chance the rain to come visit. I've heard people do not quite trust the waterfront district as it is less patrolled by members of the watch. Ormel offered to trade, but it turned out he didn't have anything but money to buy with. I was content with my current standing, so I simply then asked to rent a room. It was 10 gold and would be below deck, he said. I sat down to take in the other details, as well as to move my thoughts away from the fact that I would essentially be sleeping underwater. The cabin built on deck was very well done, taking the limited space into account. Much of it centered around the main mast, which was a cool detail. This probably provided a lot of structure. Even though no one was there at the time of my visit, tables seemed to have just been emptied, or perhaps they were readied in anticipation of those like me escaping the weather. The bar was of workable quality, and I did trust that all dishes were clean. There were different bottles of wine, the apparent favorite of the establishment, though it seemed Ormel was running low as he didn't offer any during trade. After some pleasant conversation, I decided I'd go below deck and find my room. It existed, I can say that for certain. It was very, very dusty, and the bedclothes were worn from many months of use. There was also a random bag on the table full of gems. As it wasn't mine, I didn't take from it. With all said and done, I had little choice but to rest, as the rain would prevent any important business from being completed. Finding a little solace, I pulled out a book and began to read, the gentle swaying of the boat threatening to make me seasick. Eventually, I got used to it and drifted off, but not for long. There was a bit of a scuffle outside the door, and when I opened it, there was a dangerous-looking man who revealed himself to be part of a crew of brigands. He unfortunately threatened me with violence, and so he had to be removed from the hall. Apparently, he had taken the keys and locked the orc bouncer away. Once freed, Grauman told me that we had been taken out to sea in some unknown direction. He would bring us back if I could clear the rest of the boat of thieves. I tried reasoning with Minx, the Dunmer just outside the hall, but she didn't listen either. Out on deck was a man named Wrath, who cared very little for his fellow brigands. I sent him to meet them regardless. Finally, I happened to find the key to Ormel's room, where he was being held hostage by Celine. To her credit, she survived 2 bashes from my shield. Still, she fell as all the others did. If only they would have listened to reason. Speaking of reason, I learned that all of this was Ormel's mistake. He had made up a story about treasure hidden in the boat, thinking it would bring in customers. Sadly, he was sorta right. He apologized and promised to squash the rumor, which I do think will impact his business to some extent. Overall, my stay was eventful and dangerous, and the room was nothing to write home or students about. I suppose I can give this place 3 stars for the simple novelty of it being on a boat, but not 4 stars since it lacked wine while I was present. Real quick, I just wanted to break character and add that this is one of those rare times where you can actually affect the outcome of the story. You can't avoid fighting the brigands through dialogue, but you can threaten Celine at the end, telling her you've killed all her members. She'll give you her sword, the Blackwater Blade, and agree to surrender, at which point she's locked downstairs in a room that cannot be entered. The implication is that she's handed over to the authorities upon arrival at the waterfront. It would be really cool if she could then be found at the Imperial City's prison, but I don't think that's the case. Either way, I always love choice in stories. Oh, also, that bag is called the hidden bag because it's supposed to be stuck in one of the dishes. In the original, I believe it works correctly, but as we've seen so far, Oblivion's physics engine can be pretty wonky. Anxious to have solid ground beneath my boots, I began my journey southwest toward Gottschalk Inn. It sat very near the imperiled city of Kvatch, and during the time of my visit, I knew the hero himself was currently battling to save us. While they fought difficult enemies in dimensions beyond Cyrodiil, I chose to continue my minor study, for if I intervened, even in a good way, what might happen? Just outside the inn is a stable for horses, complete with straw and a sleeping area. It also has tools for general groundskeeping and a sad resting area for the worker. The inn itself is a very pretty building, reminiscent of the styles of Coral. A variety of flowers are grown outside, pleasing to the eye and taunting to the alchemist. Gottschalk Inn was very warm inside, comforting to the senses. An Imperial guard must have agreed because he drank heartily near the bar. Forok offered me a bed for just 10 gold, which is a decent price considering this is the only resting place in this stretch of Cyrodiil. The hall toward the stairs was nice with a seating area for guests. It would have been nicer with better lighting and less cobwebs though. Upon reaching the upper landing, I became a bit nervous. There was mold clearly growing along the walls, and the only real light came through windows. This would be a very dark place after sunset, and another one of those where I had to watch my back. As far as the room, it was okay. There was a dresser for storage, but it had a knocked over carafe on top, which spilled water all across it. The potted flowers were pretty, but wilting a bit. And finally, the bed was made with some of the cheapest sheets on the market. I couldn't really turn my nose up at it, as this was the nearest place to rest before Skingrad. I was also thankful not to be in Kvatch, where the war against Mehrunes Dagon was brewing. This place was fine for now. For whatever reason, rain seems to follow me into Leeuwin every chance it gets. I'm not complaining, mind you, I actually love the rain, but it does make travel somewhat difficult, and others are less likely to help me find my destinations. Thankfully, the town has streetlights and obvious signs to assist. Right near the entrance to town is the Five Claws Lodge. Upon hearing the name, you may assume it's Khajiit run. I believe you'll be surprised if you're new to the place. It's actually run by an Argonian woman named Witsy Dootsy. She's very kind, but also honest, describing the difficulties faced by the town. She offers many types of wine, most coming from the West Weald farms of Tamika and the Surly brothers. I bought a couple bottles, then rented the available room and began noting. The lodge is not in the best condition. The roof tiles are in ill repair, but do still serve the purpose of keeping the rain out. The floor is somewhat dusty, and the general look of the place is a bit drab. However, there is an abundance of alcohol and a dearth of physical messes. The food is well stored and freshly stocked each day. The bar is tidy with many bottles and mugs. Witsy Dootsy is ready to serve any number of clients. I also couldn't help but notice while perusing the wine section that her claws were indeed quite sharp. From there, I assume, comes the name. My room was the second in the building and was honestly very dirty. Nothing seemed to have been washed, and there were gouges in the pillows from overuse. Even the tapestries looked dirty in the low light, which, I should say, I provided myself by torch. Perhaps the goal was not to allow customers to see just how rough conditions were. I did allow myself a small chuckle at her note on the table. Argonians are used to eating raw fish, and her dialect was both pleasant and comforting, something I could not say about the room. The next day, after visiting Southern Books, I made my way over to the tallest tavern I had been to thus far, the Three Sisters Inn. I was going to criticize the sign location until I realized that, from the most inopportune side, no one would need to see it. That was the residential and business part of town where people were more than familiar with Leeuwin's structure. The inside of this inn, or should I say hotel, was incredible, and I do not say that lightly. The place was huge and everything was very clean and proper. The building rose 3 stories high, with gorgeous pillars and banisters. The wood carving here was quite distinct from what we've discussed inside of Imperial or Nordic taverns. It was more focused on blending smooth, rounded curves with straight edges. Although the lower floor was a bit dim, the chandelier high above did more than enough to keep things visible. I sat for a moment to take it all in, the sheer size and class of the place. There were various spots for people to sit and chat, read, or whatever else they desired. The dining hall had only 2 tables, but they were well kept. During my visit, there was a man who enjoyed the food so much he was stacking empty dishes. The halls were full of chatter, and the place felt very lively as a result. But while these people were talking, Shiravi was working. She was the eldest of the 3 titular sisters. Apparently Shimada just walked about being pretty, and poor Shomara was not very intelligent. I initially felt that Shiravi was being rude, and maybe she was. But at the same time, I know what it's like to be part of a group that's supposed to work together, and often one person does the bulk of the job. That person seems to be Shiravi. Strangely, she calls other Khajiit and Argonians savages. Perhaps a crossover from the awful Imperial opinions here. She may be trying to distance herself or prove to be one of the good ones. I wish she would simply be herself like Bugat Grabol. After talking some more, she offered me a room for 40 gold. This seemed a steal compared to the other locations of similar price. This room was on the 2nd floor and had its own entryway, reading area, dining table, storage, and more. I was blown away. This felt like an entire home upstairs, and it reminded me somewhat of my place with Anasi back in Pelagiad. I was now feeling even more homesick. Out of all the places I had stayed thus far, this had the largest room for rent. Even the bed was fantastic, and it came with a pair of complimentary black and gold house shoes. I went downstairs to compliment the trio on their work and was able to meet both Shomara and Shimada. The latter explained to me that they were upset that the Trans-Nibbon area was taken by the Imperials from elsewhere, and that this has caused animosity between the Khajiit and Argonians and the Imperials. As though serving as a living example, the ignorant Julita Plotius regarded the situation with as little understanding as possible. If I was one of the 3 sisters, I would have had her removed at once. This was still their establishment, and what a fine place it was. Although I do find Witsy Dootsy to be a kind individual, and I wouldn't mind drinking at her place again, I believe I'll be resting here upon my next visit to the town of Leowyn. I wish I could give this place 6 stars, but I'll settle with 5. Breaking character again, I wanted to say rest in peace to Renee Victor, the voice of Skyrim's female Argonians and this game's female Khajiits. We are very lucky to have gotten this gift from her, and I hope she'll remain in your memories moving forward with this game. The large settlement of Skingrad is almost as prosperous as the Imperial City in some ways. Thanks to its wines and other vineyard produce, there are people who come from miles away to do business. When they rest, they come to one of 2 places. The most popular, of course, is the Westweald Inn, named after the region from which all this bounty is grown. The building is placed townhouse style alongside other businesses, and the sign is quite hard to miss. When I arrived, it was quite dark out. I hope that all the rooms hadn't been rented for the night since I saw so many people inside already. They were enjoying the warmth of the fireplace as well as friendly conversation. The windows must have been enchanted in some way, since they let in an awful large amount of light compared to what was naturally available at 10 p.m. Between that, the fire, and candles, it would be very difficult to complete any sort of shady business here. Behind the counter, Arina Duranis served customers with a strong selection of wines from both Tamika and the Surly brothers. They probably gave her a discount considering how many bottles she had behind the counter. She then spoke of the lack of crime in the city and how it was very safe. This almost put me at ease, but I felt like somebody was watching me. Anyway, for 20 gold, Arina rented me a room. I walked upstairs to see another check-in counter with the till completely unattended. They certainly did trust in their clientele. Up here were also comfortable tables to drink and rest at. It was a very classy place. The room was beautiful. The bed sat along a full wall of window panes. The blankets and such were clean, and there was plenty storage. However, there was a chair with no table to read upon, and no light or writing utensils to be seen at the desk. Perhaps these all had to be requested, but at most other establishments they were commonplace. Since no one else seemed to be in their rooms, I decided to look for a set of candles. I didn't want to bother the publican, after all. I found myself looking at rooms with 2 beds, still very nice and clean, but each of those only had a single candle. Finally, I found a room with 2. Only this time there was a book of Mythic Dawn commentaries sitting nearby. For a moment I planned to go downstairs and ask about it, but then I reminded myself I could not affect the timeline. The hero would take care of this for us. Trying to put this out of my mind, I decided I would go speak to Sendirian. As you no doubt remember, this master alchemist had a permanent room and lab below the inn. Trust me, it was also hard not to warn him of the Falmer. You may ask, how can I call myself his friend if I would not prevent such a tragedy? My answer is, maybe I can't. Though he certainly did, and that's enough for me. I do believe he would understand. The Westweald Inn is bittersweet for me. I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness in these various endeavors, but the service was good and the room decent. I give this place 4 stars. I also felt I was being watched as I left, but I turned around to see no one. All this travel must be getting to my head. The other tavern within Skingrad is called the Two Sisters Lodge. This building is within the residential district, making it a less likely stop for tourists. If the rooftops were any indication, the interior would probably need a bit of cleaning. There's no telling how many birds have visited this side of town or how long it's been since the shingles were rinsed. I was pleasantly surprised when I first went inside. It was very clean. I suppose this made sense as the city itself was so extravagant. The taverns must be too. This place, dug into the ground, was composed of 3 floors. The entryway leads you into the 2nd floor, which was a bit confusing for me at first. There weren't that many people, but there was plenty of seating to support them should they arrive. I was curious as to why, since this place was probably cheaper than the Westfield Inn. Looking down, you could see the bar. I could imagine many people here having a great time. I just wondered if something happened that I was unaware of. If this was Skingrad's worst, it certainly blew many other locations out of the water, including some within the Imperial City even. There was no shortage of drink either, and since I had picked up a good amount of gold in my travels, I decided I'd imbibe a bit. Mog was perfectly pleasant. She offered me a room for only 10 gold, which confirms my earlier idea. This was half the price of the other inn. Even if the rooms weren't great, the open drinking area was actually wonderful. All of us should visit this place sometime soon. To be honest, the next few pages of my notes were a bit scrawly. I think the wine had taken hold at that point, and many of my adjectives were not as prosaic as I would have liked them to be. I remember the room was fine as any, and the bed was super clean and comfortable. I didn't even get in trouble for jumping on it. I do remember writing notes in the dark, which probably didn't help the legibility. There were a couple others in the tavern that night, including Agnet the Pickled, a Nord who forsook ale and beer for the local wine. That was very telling to me. Then there was Sarathad, a dapper man who assisted Mog with the taps. I remember Mog explained the name of the tavern and that her sister ran stables outside of town. I was quite tired of walking by this point in my journey, so I made a visit to her the next morning. For only 1,000 gold, I became the proud owner of a beautiful bay horse. This would aid greatly in my travels. And a good thing too, as I would next have to travel back to the Heartlands for our last tavern in Cyrodiil. Before we move on, I just wanted to show you guys these sheep I saw leaving Skingrad. For some reason they all marched toward me and a few of them stopped. I felt like I was going to be attacked or something. I drew my weapon, then they all began to back me against the fence. What's going on here? They're adorable and I would absolutely be mean fleeced again. I came to Way riding in on a pony, to see a tavern that was rather stony. If I ever fail as an alchemist, I know I can make a killing as a wordsmith. The settlement of Way is hardly a settlement. It consists of one homestead and a single inn across the road. This place, the Walnut Inn, sort of defies business expectations. Why exactly would someone stop here rather than within the Imperial City? And further, without getting too ahead of myself, the inn costs 10 gold a night, which is equivalent to that of the King and Queen Tavern. No offense meant to Nerusa, of course, who was very pleasant. I just suppose that most of her clientele must have come from the road, since the placement here was puzzling. Indeed, as if to confirm my suspicions, there was only one other person here save for myself. He was a shady sort and kept beckoning me to him. Knowing the roads were commonly patrolled, I felt no fear stepping up, my hand on the hilt of my blade. He was offering a strange assortment of enchanted goods and generic armors. I'm still unsure why he had to act so dodgy. As mentioned though, Nerusa was quite kind, interesting even. She told me of her wine collection and asked that I bring her any Shadow Banished wine that I found. It was apparently found in old forts, made by an old alchemist that imbued it with Night Eye. That way the guards on late shifts could have better vision for spotting adversaries. As an adventurer, I knew I would eventually come across some, and after a sincere promise, we spoke of the rental. 10 gold later, I was taking these very notes. The place was a bit dusty, but not too dirty. Every expense was spared on decoration, and lighting was more rare than Shadow Banished wine. Nerusa, as we will speak on, slept worse than her clients. Her room downstairs had a torn set of sheets, since she used the best ones for customers. Walking up and past the cooking food and the fire, I found myself in a long hall customary of this type of inn. Though this one had the straw falling in from the ceiling, worse than any other I had visited, but not irreparable. This was simply a consequence of the rains and winds. Compared to Nerusa's room, mine was heavenly. There were mostly clean blankets and pillows, actual decoration, storage, and enough light to read by. I got the sense that every room on this floor was probably better than her own, and for that reason, Nerusa should have been, and was, cut some slack in this review. Overall, I give the place 3 stars, and I'll never forget my promise, because she shouted as I left,
"Keep looking for that wine. Farewell."
My next venture was dangerous, otherworldly. In the middle of the Niben Bay, on one particularly fine evening, rose an island of unexplainable origin. This, of course, we now know to be the work of Sheogorath. With enchanted boots and lots of cardio, I was able to cross the bay and step upon its rocky surface. The island itself was a perfect representation of the inside, bisected between 2 personalities, exuberance and depression. Walking up the bridge and into the air, one finds themselves passing between colorful trees and bright mushrooms. If taking the path below, you find yourself in the emotional depths conjured by times of great strife. So too was Sheogorath's realm of Oblivion, the Shivering Isles. Ignoring the wishes of the guard who bravely implored all visitors to turn back, I entered the portal and found myself in a twisted landscape. Part of this, I admit, was my excuse to do something reckless and dangerous, to pursue the exotic fungi of the Isles once more. The first town one will come across after entering the realm is called Passwall, aptly so. This place acts as a sort of testing ground for those seeking to pass through the wall into the two regions of the Isles, Mania and Dementia, each known to be and contain the extremities of either of those two descriptors. The buildings in this town are ramshackle messes of plating, wood, and madness intertwined. In the green fog, one almost misses them among the giant mushroom trees. These, I needed to remind myself, were nothing like the majestic emperor parasols of the Ascadian Isles. No, these contain strange magics known only to the Prince of Madness, who I very much aimed to avoid. One of these disgusting buildings was called the Wastrel's Purse, and featured free beds to any and all who should be damned to come here. Sleeping would be difficult since giant roaches roam even the outer walls of the establishment. My first step into the place was already strange. Even the plates began to dance, defying the common rules of my native plane. And right behind the counter, sad and tired, was Dreadwind the proprietor. Unfortunately for her, she seemed to be quite sick. Even still, she offered beverages including Bernice's summer wine and a Fellmore variety. I turned to survey my surroundings and, all things considered, the place looked fairly normal, other than the plated legs of swamp creatures sitting atop counters and a bust of Sheogorath along the wall. Drinking alone to the side was a Nord I would later meet named Jared Iceveins. Beyond him were the stairs, decorated with paintings of the strange landscapes in the Isles, a far cry from the Lythandus pieces of Cyrodiil. The building, unnaturally and unnecessarily tall, felt like it weighed upon my being, though I did find most of the company quite entertaining, if not entirely lucid. The bedroom felt more like a prison block, to be quite honest. There was a hole in the door so I could be watched like an animal as I slept. This room was a bizarre analogy to those of the Imperial Province, yet the bed and storage containers all felt very familiar, the former being quite itchy and uncomfortable. Even as I tried to rest, sitting atop the bed, a strange Dunmer woman threw the door open and simply left. Pursuing her, I learned her name was Romina, and she was a complete shrew, a disgrace to the name of that animal. I decided to make my own lock by bending some picks through the handle. That way she could not give in to curiosity as I battled my heavy eyes. As his world is divided in twain, so is the capital city. We'll begin with the Mania-aligned side called Bliss. Here, the people are zany, wild, and generally unable to be generalized. All the same, they share one thing in common, their devotion to the Mad Prince. Our tavern of interest here is the Choosy Beggar. A funny name, I'll grant them that. The interior is strange, as though the building was not sure what it wanted to be. It had very tall, stretched windows made of what seems to be amber, a material often employed in town by the resident smith. The nearby dining room was nice, I suppose, but there were many spots on the walls that my eyes could not decipher between dirty tapestries or covered crawl spaces. Also, there were very creepy stone busts of people looking skyward, right near strange, uncrossable bridges under which two Argonians were conversing. One I later found was the publican, a man named Ravenbiter, and for some reason he told me to stay away from his wife, a woman I had never even met. He reiterated this multiple times when offering me the cheap room. I got the feeling that maybe she wasn't quite faithful to him. Either way, I took the key and continued to explore the inn. The food on tables was a kind offering, but I did not see myself eating much during this trip, although I must admit I was curious as to what the alocasia fruit tasted like when cooked. I began my way up the stairs to find my room, and hopefully not Ravenbiter's wife. I truly did enjoy the design of the windows. It was very unique, chaotic, and somehow calming. Unfortunately, my room had no windows. What it did have was 3 random people having a conversation while I was waiting to rest. They had the nerve to look at me as though I was not supposed to be there. They eventually did leave, allowing me to view it in peace. It was shaped like a long hall, with a nice bed built upon a stone frame. This was dangerously comfortable, and gave you the feeling of wanting to sleep forever. No doubt it was enchanted. I began to recognize the red on the walls as a scuffed wallpaper of sorts, and very much disliked the nearby bust of Sheo, with a full head of lettuce and a handful of yarn offered to him. I did go talk to that Bosmer woman, Thadil, who was in my room before. Apparently she was a performer. Outside the inn, she showed me some of her talents. As far as I could tell, she was quite good, despite her self-deprecation. She deserved praise, and the jugglers in the early 3rd era could have learned many a thing from her. Hello again, me here. I wanted to show everyone this door on the top floor. It leads to the balcony apparently, but looking at it spatially makes 0 sense. as the door is halfway between the room and the exterior. Moving straight through it makes this plain to see and even shows that most of the door resides within the bedroom. The sliver that remains mystically teleports you outside onto the balcony. Just some more Sheo magic. Adventurers who prioritize some sanity over blind happiness are the only ones who will appreciate the dark, depressing town of Crucible, the capital of dementia. Our point of interest here is sickly Bernice's tap house, named after Bernice, a woman who is chronically ill, of course. The sign and lighting are, in accordance, quite sick. The building itself is a strange shape with a curved roof with random geometric shapes placed within. The rooftop is empty, though it seems at one point that it was host to sparring battles and drinking games. The bar is long inactive with the lockbox left to wither. While I was carefully exploring the terrace, I began to notice strange caches of items placed across the various rooftops and the town. I bravely began following their trail, not at all stalling my eventual entrance and possible contraction of a contagious chronic disease within the tap house. These pack rat spoils eventually led to a note with a key. The page contained the scrawlings of a madman explaining his paranoia and fear of others in the town. He, if my inclination was correct, even mentions Bernice's tap house himself. Apparently he had stashed some items nearby. I had no wish to wade through the sewage water behind the tavern, and so I steeled my resolve and climbed back down to enter. The interior, just like outside, was very oddly shaped. It was dark, with no one in attendance but myself and the creepy statues. Here I spotted an example of normal food, bread, which was so ironic since I could not chance eating it for worry of catching Bernice's disease. I also would never eat at this table while being leered at by a stone statue. Bernice stood alone, vigilant, in the corner behind the bar. It was sad to see her still trying, regardless of the burden she bore. Many bottles lined the counter and the tables behind, and she even tried to make do with the grumite eggs as a menu item. When talking about the room for rent, she reminded me not to get too close to her, only after instilling worry in me that I may already have contracted it anyway. I brushed off these worries and ventured into the final inn room I would have to visit in this era. The furniture was stone, cold, and uncomfortable, but it did look quite cool. The beds and chairs had dragon's talons, and the nearby table was held aloft by stone hunger, looking quite famished indeed. A dining area was placed far in the corner, and the massive open room was mostly wasted for the damp, fetid air. My table was empty of food, with only one beer bottle to keep me company. Luckily, I had saved many over my entire journey.
Fatal the Juggler.
I'm sure you've heard of me.
I have had an absolute blast with the Oblivion remaster. I have 4 characters thus far, and this release was the kicker that finally made me fulfill the ends of the Elder Scrolls idea. The taverns of Cyrodiil are the most numerous, 34 including places you can actually sleep, compared to the 18 of Morrowind, or technically 17 of Skyrim. These inns actually serve a purpose as well, as opposed to Morrowind where guild halls ended up taking the place of them. The addition of the level up symbol in the corner was also a boon, and I still remember my first time paying 10 gold to rest at the Merchant's Inn. It was one of those major immersion moments for me. I felt like I was actually on an adventure, not like I was metagaming in order to level as fast as possible while keeping all my gold. And speaking of gold, all the prices are varied dependent upon the quality and location of the inn. This is a feature that existed within Arena as a fledgling idea, albeit for different rooms within the same tavern, but has never been the case with the distinct establishments before or since Oblivion. Now, one could still argue that player homes remove the necessity of rentals as well, but you do have to work up to save for one of those houses. Inns still serve a purpose in the early game, and if you're more of a role player that games in a very specific way, these taverns offer many stories and experiences for you to tell others about. I even met Maik the Liar on foot while journeying between locations for the study. And how about those sheep that randomly found me as I explored the vineyards to explain the setting and Skingrad? I never would have experienced these small moments if I spent all my time fast traveling to and from objectives or Frostcrag Spire. Also, I would say the physics engine of Oblivion both added and removed some options for my storytelling, so I apologize if I seem to have gone back and forth, removing points from some and ignoring the issues for others. It wasn't exactly preferential treatment, but I did try to think of how I would feel if I had seen these things myself. I believe my ratings were honest, and I would love to hear how you felt about my inclusion of those little bugs we know and love. In truth, I had only ever visited 12 of the 34 taverns of Cyrodiil in earnest, meaningfully exploring them for the purpose of a quest or personal interest. Now that I've surveyed all of them, I can definitively express that Oblivion's inns are sincerely wonderful. Many of my adventures in Skyrim were fraught with danger, whether I was combating people or even dragons. But luckily it seemed they could sense and perhaps share in my calm state, as I was not attacked once by them across the entire duration of my recent visit to the province. My travels were peaceful and led me to so many beautiful places in between each and every destination. Between the 3rd and 4th eras, the Nords opted for simplicity over extravagance. This can be seen in many of their taverns, which are created in very strict designs, perhaps according to labor laws or a monopoly of construction businesses, the latter of which is probably more likely as the Nords tend to adhere to traditions more than rules. There are 18 inns within Skyrim that match our guidelines for discussion. One of these is a stretch, a special mention of sorts, which we will get to in a short while. Most of these are spread throughout the various cities, but also the wilderness. The health benefits for resting regularly have become more clear, and as people recognize the need for good sleep in the past era, they now understand the benefit of routine. Their talents seem naturally enhanced by this newfound experience. With this information in tow, let us speak of Skyrim's inns. Our story in the province begins in Dawnstar, far to the north. I'd hoped to avoid the cold for at least a short while, but alas, the best way to get used to cold water is to just dive in. Within this small town is the Wind Peak Inn, a tavern that will set the precedent of shape for many we see down the line. It's covered in straw and snow, and has unique curved wood ridges characteristic of Nordic architecture. There are visible hack marks in the beams from when they were being cut and shaped, something to remind us that every bit of this place was handmade. Just outside is a small farm area where 2 chickens roam. They must be a specific breed from the region to survive easily in the cold climate. It's as if nothing phases them whatsoever. One of the inn workers, Abilene, chops wood for the fire, which is very important because of its location. Native snowberries grow along the stairs, which could be intentional or natural. Either way, these are very enjoyable ingredients, and I admit I snagged a few. Resistance to frost comes in handy, especially in Skyrim. The interior of the inn was quite warm, with a decent fire roasting in the center of the main hall. This created a great atmosphere, aided by the musician playing near the bar. Thoring, the proprietor, had many types of cheeses, meats, and spices for sale alongside alcohol, which was often either wine, beer, or ale, naturally. I could tell he was seasoned in his work, as he had the tired look of a man with many stories to tell, yet no time. Behind the bar was an array of drinks ready to go. There was also a small amount of gold, and a steel hammer in case anything went wrong with the customer. He was so prepared he even had an extra spigot should the one on the keg break. The cheese, although aged, was not as smelly as those contained by Sathasa at Border Watch, and if I thought Colovians had large alcohol stores, it was nothing compared to those held by the Nords. There were giant kegs in the back that must have been quite difficult to transport to this location. Fresh baked bread sat on a nearby shelf, and it was incredible to consider just how much of this was the result of teamwork. Thoring did not work alone, as we had already seen. For most locations in Cyrodiil, the publican themselves was responsible for the entire establishment. But here, many tables line the walls of the building, full of various types of food. Bread, eggs, fish, cheese, you name it. There seemed to be no limit to the abundance of things on the menu, to say nothing of its limited richness, and the wine certainly helped a lot of it flow. Up above Thoring were various slaughterfish he or his family had caught, and along the high beams, lighting the place, were Nordic horn sconces, each bearing a single small flame with disproportionate range. If they weren't so averse to magic, I would assume something was at play here, though it could simply be a traditional technique of making a lot from a little. When I finally spoke to Thoring, he offered me everything on the menu, and I did take him up on a few items. He also rented me a room for only 10 gold, the standard price for Skyrim, and even led me to it. This room was interesting, and my first example within Skyrim, so it was difficult to gauge exactly how to rank it. I am, of course, accustomed to a different style of location, so I apologize if I come off as spoiled. However, a new era has begun since we were in Cyrodiil, and it seems that Skyrim has not yet caught up to those levels of comfort. Firstly, I want to say that Thoring was very nice and helpful. That covered, this room was not great. The ground was mostly bare, hard stone with cracks throughout it. Animal skins covered spots of the floor and walls, which I suppose fit the theme of the region, but this just led me to think of hygiene problems. Adding to this, 2 large elk heads were mounted above the bed, which could have fallen on me in my sleep. The other mounted head, that of a bear, was randomly placed on the other wall above some storage sacks. It seemed that decoration was not Thoring's foray. Also, there were 2 dressers for some reason, which, while not problematic at all, just seemed a bit redundant. It wasn't as if there were 2 beds here. A table sat near the doorless doorway, and there was a strong lockable chest on the ground beside it. And now, we get to the bed. A very shoddy, hastily formed frame contained wooden slats upon which were heads of straw. Over this was one large animal skin blanket, which may have been a combination of wolf or goat fur. The pillow was a small sack, and although it didn't look obscenely dirty, I had to wonder how many people had used it and how often it was washed. I really didn't want to sleep in a doorless room again, and so I went to check across the way. Those rooms were doorless as well, and quite small. Each came with a bed, cupboard, table, and chest. Above either, under a shared open ceiling, was another mounted elk head. If I was thankful for anything in my rental, it was that there was less room between me and the elk above me, so I had a better chance of survival in the case of an accident, say, a single wing beat from an approaching dragon. One bit of decoration that seemed quite pleasant initially was this red wreath made of snowberries. It seemed appropriate for the region, almost as if it were set for the holidays. Then I remembered what I saw upon entering. There was a wreath much like this one, but nearby it was a smaller, magical wreath that phased into the wall. I had no idea what or if to say anything about it. In the coming days I would always be reminded of it, and you'll learn soon enough why this was the case. The Wind Peak Inn, a prime example of Skyrim's most common taverns, left a lot to be desired. Although the service was nice, there was no privacy, little decoration, and the heat from the fire didn't reach the itchy bed, even through the empty doorway. As such, I have to give this place a ranking of 2 stars. In the western reaches of Skyrim exists a fantastically carved bridge over the Karth River. This bridge, known as the Dragon Bridge, has also become the namesake of a town just across it. Here, logging is the primary trade, where a mill uses hydropower for the assisted cutting of timber. For those just stopping by on their way through, the Four Shields Tavern is the place to go. And if I have noted one thing I really enjoy about the taverns of Skyrim, it's that the signs are usually quite unique. Other than the blue mountain flowers and thistle growing in place of snowberries, this tavern is basically identical in exterior to the Wind Peak Inn. As mentioned before, this could be due to a monopoly of the carpentry business, or a long-held tradition based on Nordic folklore. I can imagine a story in which a Nord hero built the first major tavern of the region. All the others hailed him for his achievement, and henceforth declared all taverns would be made in its likeness. Question is, should tradition get in the way of progress? And is this hypothetical story even close to the genuine reason for the direct replication? I was stuck on this question when I witnessed another worrying sight. The wreaths were here again, and so were the same bookshelves containing the same foods, drinks, and baskets. And the bar's preparation, for which I previously praised Thoring, was exactly the same, right down to the 5 gold, 3 sacks, steel hammer, and selection of cheeses. Was I losing my mind? I couldn't have been, but even the side rooms were the same. Nearly every detail was the same. Eventually, shaking my head and trying to dispel the deja vu, I went up to the bar to speak with Fida. Other than some preposterous rumors of a face dancer, she did have great wine, including a somewhat rare Argonian blood wine, straight from the marsh. She rented me a room, then showed me to it. And by it, I mean the exact same room I was shown by Thoring, right down to the placement of everything. Just then, I remembered the man from before, warning me about going down this path. Norden Ramsey, he was called. Was this the road I wasn't meant to see? Was I stepping into something larger than myself, placing myself in danger? Were Fida and Thoring great friends without their own sense of style? As I left town, I made sure to take a good long walk to clear my mind. Something clearly wasn't right. In my homeland, even the inns created by the same great houses contained some variation. Surely tradition could not answer for all the strange happenings here. No, I assured myself, I must simply be lacking sleep. I've been away from home a long time now, and when I got back to Pelagia to finish my study, this would simply be a novelty. Far to the east and south of Dragon Bridge is the town of Falkreath. This is a dreary place, known for its ever-expanding cemetery and funeral rites. Fittingly, the bar here is known as the Dead Man's Drink, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way to cope with their predominant line of business. If I could say one thing about the building's exterior, it would be that the vines on the wall were a nice touch. Beyond this, there was nothing remarkable that set the drink apart from the other places we've discussed so far. A cart full of cabbages sat outside, getting rained on. It seemed no one was in a rush to bring them in. My first step into the inn instilled fear within me.
Leave me alone!
I was not dreaming. I was not making this up. When I asked others around me, they suggested I'd had too much ale, despite me not drinking any since I entered Skyrim. One fellow even suggested I drink more, which I was nowhere near close to doing. I scanned my eyes over the tavern, noting all the similarities of both the Wind Peak Inn and the Four Shields. The bookshelves were here, the wreaths, and many of the tables were the same. But here, there were more entertainers, one man playing the lute and another woman cleaning between songs. There also was an alchemy table in the far corner. I had no idea who would have placed this here, but I was able to use it to restore some of my stock, thankfully. And I have to say, some of the food was different. For example, this basket of pine thrush eggs was novel. As a man drummed, I stepped over to the bar, which was larger and somewhat different than the others, with Valga, the owner, preferring an axe to a hammer. After a quick payment, I was shown to a slightly better room than those that came before. There were no mounted animal heads to fall on me, a wider bed, decent lighting, and still no door. The people of Skyrim must be very trusting, since a table near the doorway held a small sum of gold on its surface. Perhaps this was a tip for Valga. If this was the kind of service that deserved tipping, I thought, then I may need to adjust my view of inns for the region. One thing I cannot adjust to is the lack of a door though, and so I will give this tavern a slightly higher ranking of 3 stars. At the base of the throat of the world lies the settlement of Iverstead. This town serves as the starting point for many pilgrimages up to High Hrothgar, home of the Greybeards. To guarantee a successful journey, many of these travelers will stop at the Villamire Inn, settling their packs and resting before the arduous climb of 1,000 steps. Like with similar inns, this tavern's only distinction is its native flora just outside the door. For once inside, I was met with the same confounded wreaths as the others, the same shelves, and everything else the same. To top it off, this place is host to the most careless people it seems, with no regard for personal space. Lindley swept and tried her hardest to keep the place clean, but the dust kept getting caught in cracks in the floor. She even attempted to sweep up the kettle, the poor lady. Wilhelm's bar was slightly off from regulation, with an axe instead of the hammer and a shortened L-shaped bar that had much less container space. As such, his out-the-wine stores had to be moved behind him along the wall. For 10 gold, he showed me to the leftmost bed in a nearby room. There was barely any light here, but that did not stop weeds from growing up through the splits in the stone. The classic tip table was present, but with very little decoration, and only one side of the room had storage space. Lindley did offer to play her lute for a while, which was very charming and enjoyable. She and Wilhelm suggested various meals, and I eventually allowed myself to try some pie while I listened. The room was absolutely pitiful, but because of their attentive service, I will give this inn 3 stars. We do have to keep in mind that this is compared to other similar inns, of course. It was very late when I made it to Kynes Grove, a brisk day's travel northeast from Iverstead. During our study of the 9 Divines, I mentioned that this town was originally meant to be a logging hub. Of course, they learned the trees were sacred to Kinnereth, and so they had to halt that activity. Instead, they began mining materials from the nearby mountains. In fact, during my visit to the Braidwood Inn, there were plenty of miners just outside, resting in tents. I found this strange and wondered why the workers weren't simply given rooms in the tavern. Perhaps another wing could have been added to accommodate them, or maybe that would have gone against traditional architecture. Near the camp were racks of fish and a small but successful farm. It looked like the beginnings of a nice settlement, but it still rubbed me the wrong way that they were made to rest in the cold. The Braidwood Inn had dragon's tongue planted out front, and deer skulls affixed to the columns supporting the awning. These did serve to set it apart, albeit slightly, from the other taverns of this style. The sign looked almost mystical, as though this could have been a secret hideout for Mages Guild remnants. The interior was exactly what you would expect, wreaths and all. The catch of the year hung high on the far wall, and Idra stood ready to serve, even though the slightest whisper would echo in the empty tap house. To her credit, she followed rules well. The shelves of Elves' Ear, beer, bread, and wine were located as designated by ancient decree. The bar, too, was a return to form. 5 gold, 3 sacks, a steel hammer, and, as a wild card, some pine thrush eggs thrown into the mix. Part of me wanted to ask Idra about the miners outside, but after seeing the others sleeping in their rooms, what I really wanted was to hit the hay. Literally, in this case. Instead, I asked to rent a room, and she led to a large one off the side. This was arranged differently than most rooms, apart from the mounted heads. Unfortunately, a man decided he would try and watch my companion and I rest, at which point she promptly left the room to complain. While he gathered his things to leave, I went across the room and spoke to Dravinia, the stoneweaver, who managed to keep the mine from collapsing on the workers. No doubt the constant mental maintenance made her quite tired, so I thanked her for her time and went on. The bedroom had storage, a small dining table, decent lighting, and enough alcohol to keep the night young. Unfortunately, a red wreath hung there, mocking me in silence. This room, and the place in general, was good enough to merit 3 stars. I would make it a very generous 4 if Idra would clear out some tables in the main hall to place beds for the miners. You know, those folk who support the stability of the town. Markarth, funny enough, marks the first completely unique entry into our study of Skyrim's taverns. It is here, in the ancient stone-hewn city built by the Dwemer, that the Silverblood Inn was set. The establishment lies at the bottom of the great central stone pillar and is marked by a Nordic sign which does betray its difference from the thematic rock of the city. The emblem is a pickaxe crossed with a hammer, blood dripping from each of them, and just alongside it is a symbol many would be smart to memorize, for, to the Thieves Guild, it expresses danger. I momentarily reached for my blade just to make sure it was still there. With that secured, I pressed in, finding a wide, strangely fitting room for a tavern. It was stone and bronze, mixed with whatever other metals the Dwemer could find. Pipes and other various shapes climbed the walls, their purposes unknown. The light fixtures, including both the chandeliers and wall sconces, were too complex for the owner to figure out, and so candles were placed in front of them. To be fair, the gas power of the Dwemer contained great magics that were never clearly documented. At least Klepper, the publican, figured out the pipes over the fireplace, which seemed to be serving their purpose just fine. And atop the fireplace, of course, was the classic slaughterfish. This one seemed to be about the same size as some of the smaller ones in other taverns. I wondered if there was some sort of sportsmanship among the tavern keeps, where each of them attempted to outdo one another with a large catch. If so, it seems that some were quite lucky with where they cast their lines. Because of the symbol carved in the doorway, I thought it would be a good idea to avoid peeking behind the counter, just in case something was misunderstood. Even if I wanted to, the lighting was angled in such a way that barely anything could be made out, which may have included a weapon. This off-putting feeling was strong, also stemming from the fact that no one in the tavern spoke to me or sought me out for conversation. It felt as though they were all just watching me. I could hear some people speaking and getting ready in what I assumed were the workers' quarters, but beyond that, nothing. That is, until Frabby came to offer me a drink. The sudden sound was almost jarring in the silence, but I was thankful for it. I ordered some baked potatoes, famished from the long journey here, and to avoid bearing the lead, I never did find the source of danger that I had been warned of. Klepper was a strange individual, but kind enough to show me to my room. It was a bit cramped, to be honest, with very little light and a bed made of stone. There was no way I would feel comfortable here, even if I took all the sacks of flour in the corner to add cushion. When I did try the bed, I looked up to see a strange contraption poking through the ceiling. The stonework around it was very well carved, but the lack of explanation for this mechanism was concerning. For all I knew, it would spew poison. I did get my own mini keg, which was quite novel, as well as some dishes haphazardly thrown upon the table. But instead of a fork for my potatoes, I was given a spoon, which hardly served the same function. I went back out to request a trade, but then came upon a few other visitors. One was a mercenary for hire. Another was a talented musician who played the lute to the enjoyment of everyone, including my companion. It was one of those moments where I let down my guard and just enjoyed something for once. An example of intrinsically mortal art. I don't regret it, even if it meant my back was to the door. What I do regret is that I had to teach Koznak a lesson in humility, just after giving him a beer too. He instigated the bet on his success, of course, and I did help him up when it was over. But with the Forsworn attacking every shipment and him being out of work, it felt wrong to accept the wagered sum. Oh, and the bard almost took a hit on accident. Instead of sleeping that night, I ran my fingers along the stone etchings, puzzling out what they meant. If only I had dedicated some time to researching the Dwemer. I could send a letter to my friend Darren Nivos, and perhaps the two of us would work on a project together. Though I'm sure his head is buried in the mounds of Dwemer artifacts he, very legally acquires for study. Overall, I give the Silverblood Inn 3 stars. I admire the willingness to build a tavern within such an ancient and oddly appropriate structure. There was wonderful music, drinking, good food, and even a merry scuffle. But what I did not enjoy was the crick in my neck that I woke with the next morning. Deep in the Reach, along the Karth River, is an unsuspecting settlement known as Old Rodan. Once a large group of buildings and trade hubs, it has now been reduced to a landmark, the Old Rodan Inn, where Tiber Septim himself was said to have stayed at one point. Its deeper history is a subject of debate between the Reachmen and the Nords, with each claiming to have owned the property in years long lost. My approach to the Old Rodan Inn was marked by rain, rock, and dead trees. It was a gloomy yet comfortable day. Leontius chopped and carried wood for the fire, a good sign that this place was consistently cared for. I also noticed something a bit strange. The trees here, though mostly dead and fed upon by fungi, had grown up and out of large boulders. Generally, even if a tree should break through a rock, which happens often enough, the roots are still underground, such as with the yellow birch. There still needs to be a large network reaching into the ground for nutrients, as well as the water table. In these cases, the roots seem almost entirely topside. If this was for gas exchange or some other necessity, I imagine they would look more like the pneumatophores in Vardenfell's Bitter Coast. But perhaps there's another explanation for this. Let me know what you think. It seems they're proud enough of this natural ability to use it as the emblem for the inn. Upon entry, I was called up to the bar by the owner, Itis. She offered me Tiber Septim's room, and told me he had conquered this land from the Reachmen hundreds of years ago. Apparently this was his first victory on his road to forming the Empire. I don't know what I expected, but the room was a lot less grand than I imagined. Not so much in the way that it was a poor example of Skyrim's usual taverns, but that it was so simple for such a non-simple entity. Just then I thought of something. Idis told me the room had not been changed since Tiber Septim slept there, only cleaned when necessary. Is this the focal point of the tradition? The reason that all similar inns are routinely maintained to the exact same degree in some cases? I supposed it could have been, and looking at the modest arrangements, it makes sense to me that the Nords would try to emulate it as a constant reminder to them, especially in the case of the current civil war. The rest of the inn was pretty much the same as the others, being the possible prototype and all, right down to the mystical, mysterious, esoteric wreath placement that no one would dare speak of. Maybe Idis' son Skuli would end up running the place and maintaining that tradition, considering he has already been taught to serve the menu. There was a moment where I considered that place out of time, a location that was meant to emulate its origins hundreds of years ago. Maybe all the other taverns were intended as respectful reenactments, but they came to my mind as cheap copies of what stood before me. Whether you support the Empire or not, it's an important historical landmark and, strangely enough, Idis barely seems to be making it through monetarily. With all this information, one would think it a common pilgrimage location. Perhaps it is, but I do believe that if it's so important to the Nordic people, it should probably be visited often. That way they can deter the Reachmen they so heavily despise. As it was also a place they owned, they'll probably want it back at some point. It is a hard sell, tradition, but for the history involved here and the questions it made me ask, I'm willing to give this inn 4 stars. Morthal is not a town for the faint of heart. It seems everything is out to harm you, be it the many mosquitoes hailing from the swamps, or the endemic, poisonous plant and fungal life. The buildings of the settlement rise from the water, a strangely fast-moving marsh known as the Drakmir. In that case, it's interesting that the inn should be called Moorside, when a moor is typically much drier than a marsh. But I digress. In the future, I would love to research each of these towns in more detail, but for now, baby steps. The inn is rather lackluster on the exterior, and its signage is somewhat foreboding. A moon with half its face hidden, the other half seriously examining the viewer. Nothing says comfort to me like being judged before I even open the door. What a fool I would be not to expect the wreaths. They live in my brain now, forever onward. A mystery that no one will ever explain to me clearly enough. I feel as though an unknown Daedric prince called Ta Doward was hexing my mind. The only way to survive the experience is to move forward. In doing so, I found the same tables, shelves, bar, and rooms as many other inns. The publican, Jana, was open about the state of business, letting me know that this place, like many others in town, was struggling to stay afloat. Pardon the pun. Even so, they run like normal. Speaking to Jana was eye-opening. Without many visitors, there must be few people to tell stories to, since she even told me about a possible murder of a man's own family, along with her minor disdain of the orc bard that frequents the place. Lurbik seemed very kind to me, and although he didn't play while I was there, I think his efforts to keep things interesting are lost on the publican. Perhaps with a bit of practice, Lurbik could entice more people to give the place business. As it stands, this inn is perhaps the most devoid of character thus far. As such, I can only offer 2 stars. Riften is a town that I openly abhor. I must admit that every visit is something of a stressor for me. This time I had company, thankfully, so we could watch each other's backs. And since I do have friends here, it leaves only the most unscrupulous to try and remove items from my possession, or worse. There's no secret that this town is home to crime itself, but it also has 2 somewhat less corrupt business ventures that help it maintain. These are fishing and beekeeping. Right along the edge of Lake Honrik, the strictly local anglers can always be trusted to reel in a haul. The prices are somewhat suspect, but these are the best fish suppliers in the region, especially southeastern Skyrim. When it comes to bees, Lake Honrik sports the largest apiary in the province. The Golden Glow estate sits dead center of the lake's widest partition. Here, honey is made and sold to the Blackbriar Meadery, the fame of whom relieves me from writing any more about it. It's probably no secret to many of you just how unique the Bee and Barb is as a tavern. First, it's a completely different layout to any other inn within the province. Second, it's the first and only inn run by an Argonian. For all the negative things I can say about Riften, I must admit it's far more inclusive than other places, especially Windhelm, which we will discuss in a short while. Kirava, the owner, is interesting. She's about as kind as anyone else in town, but that isn't saying too much. Otherwise, she simply does her job, except she doesn't show customers to their rooms. I looked all across the building until I finally came across the rental. It was an absolutely abysmal room. A terrible bed with most of its straw falling fallen out, a randomly placed wooden chair, a chest with a broken lock, and the same terrible, evil thing of my nightmares acting as a nightmare pitcher versus a dream catcher. Downstairs, the dining area was wide open and clean. Tables were set with lots of food, and I could easily understand how this business survived the Blackbriar monopoly. With a full stomach and an overflowing mug, it would be difficult to complain. In fact, for this reason alone, I enjoyed my time here. I simply struck up conversation with different people, sharing in meals and storytelling. Sometimes the topic would shift toward less agreeable means, and even then, I would be happy to know more about the opinions of those living in Skyrim. I eventually spoke to Talon J, a bartender from the Black Marsh and Cyrodiil borderline. He told me he aimed to marry Kurava, and also that he made his own special beverages, many of which were combinations of foreign drinks. I of course bought some before talking to a few others. Talon J went back to cleaning, and after some merriment, I started to get a little more curious. Following the smell of charcoal, I found the kitchen. It was much cleaner than many I'd seen so far. Sadly, that feeling of comfort only lasted until I went downstairs, where apples and other vegetables were spilled on the floor. Most other things were kept off the ground though, so this must have been an accident they'd not yet caught. Finally, I saw the giant ale kegs. These things looked as though they would never empty, but with a supply of customers this big, it must have been harder to keep them stocked. I wish I could give this tavern a better score. Strictly as a place to drink and converse, there are a few better locations to visit, but the rental rooms are glorified closets and no more. As such, I will give this place 3 stars. My time in Skyrim was characterized by rain, cold, and the dank smell of drenched straw. So it was with Riverwood, a town known to some as the first settlement at which the Dragonborn notified civilians of Alduin's return. And speaking of the Dragonborn, they stayed at the Sleeping Giant Inn during their time here, having a fortuitous meeting with Delphine, a member of the Blades. As far as exteriors go, this one is par for the course, though its signage is very unique and memorable, one of the only human depictions in the province that isn't uncomfortable to look at. The usual fire pit, shelving, wreaths, and bar layout are all here, but there are definitely a few things that set this place apart from any similar tavern. Firstly, the aforementioned Delphine used to run the Sleeping Giant, but after her meeting with the Dragonborn, she left Orgnar in charge of the place. Therefore, if one wants a room or food, they talk to him. Even better, it turns out that Orgnar knows a thing or two about alchemy and will even point newcomers to the nearby public table. On top of this, he'll inform you of a basic healing potion recipe, which, while nowhere near the best of those concoctions, is still a kind act. The inn has a small stock of ingredients as well, including those needed for that very potion. When asked about a room, Orgnar momentarily forgot he was in charge, but then he did something different. He led me to a small room on the other side of the tavern. And get this, there were doors on the rentals. It may sound patronizing, but as we've seen with other similar establishments, this is a rare and generous offering. The eastern room is quite large, with one of the nicest beds we've seen thus far, though, as is understandable, they don't rent it out to just anyone. Here it was that the Dragonborn was able to stay, making it a hotspot of interest for passersby. However, there's another reason customers are not allowed to rent the room. Along one of the walls is a wardrobe locked shut. If opened, it reveals a simple wooden wall. A couple shoves and one would find themselves in Delphine's secret underground planning room. Of course, this is hearsay, as Orgnar would not allow me inside. I almost told him I knew of its existence, but I was sure he'd heard of that one before. It was said that visitors heard clashing, puffs of magic, and other various sounds below them as they drank. However, that very activity ended up being the perfect scapegoat for their hallucinations. However useful that room may have been, it served a purpose for the Dragonborn. Without its existence, who can say whether Alduin would have been defeated? Even though the Sleeping Giant Inn is one of very similar design to many others in Skyrim, there are a few quirks that make it interesting, even if they're only rumors. There's also the fact that you can buy ingredients and brew potions here, which is a soft spot for yours truly. As such, I give this place 4 stars. Within the tundras of Whiterun Hold is a small farming town of Rorikstead. It's a small, quiet place where diligent workers live, providing an enjoyable life to their children. There are only a few types of crops grown, but these serve the families well enough. I almost missed the tavern since the sign was so difficult to read. I was trying to understand what plant was being depicted, but couldn't manage that either. Regardless of this illegibility, I noted the shape of the place to be very, very familiar. Except here, there was a small dairy corral outside, and some colorful mountain flowers begging to be made into potions. The wreaths knew no bounds here. They infested the place, hugging almost every pillar and threatening to poison the ale itself. If I hadn't known better, I'd think news of my travel had reached far and wide by this point and the townspeople were pulling a prank on me. Trying the best I could, I put this out of mind and tried to survey the location for anything untraditional. The shelves, bar, other rooms, and tables were all as expected, but this location did have one interior distinction. Above the counter was an array of animal heads, only one of them prey. There was a wolf, skeever, goat, and even a saber-toothed tiger. How exactly a saber-tooth was bested and by whom remains something of a mystery. I didn't suspect Morrowind due to his age, but maybe he had family or friends who were hunters. On that note, there were also slaughterfish, further solidifying my guess that the inns had some sort of competition going on. 2 medium and 1 large-sized fish were mounted high, signifying great pride. Although Old Rodan had a spot right along the Karth River, Rorikstead is not too far from River Hial to the north. With the 2 locations only separated by one stretch of mountains, it makes sense that they would be in communication about their angling success stories. Morrowind led me to my room, which was of common fashion. There were 2 beds in case another person needed to rest and the other 2 were full, but still no doors and no privacy whatsoever. This is not nearly the worst place I've stayed in, but certainly not the best, and the wreaths don't help it either. The City of Solitude, now controlled by the Empire, is a much different location than many I've visited in Skyrim. Where many places were quite critical of Imperial regulations and changes to tradition, this city embraced it. This can be seen in the addition of Imperial institutions such as the Bard's College or the unique tavern known as the Winking Skeever. Even the exterior is quite different and very tall, sporting honeycomb shingles and seemingly random brickwork. Its sign is one of my favorites, as the skeever looks very similar to possums of other regions. Although, it isn't winking, which is a bit of a letdown. There was something very comforting about this tavern, even with the death bells growing just inside the entryway. It was very well lit, clean, and lively, with many people sharing the space. Corpulus, the man behind the bar, told me he had a small skeever as a pet that used to wink, hence the name. Whether this is true, the moniker does stick in one's head. Leading me through the building and up the stairs, Corpulus showed me the finest room I had slept in yet. There were fine cheeses and vegetables on silver dishes, a huge carafe of mead to drink, which I did partake of, though mead is a bit sweet for my taste. In the corner was a fantastic writing desk, and it still looked very nice despite my accidental knocking over of a vase and some potions. On a shelf were many books to read to keep me busy, and while laying in the bed and surveying the room, I realized just how much tradition had been holding the people of Skyrim back. Nothing to do with religion, of course, but simply how they forced themselves to maintain inefficient and uncomfortable inns based upon an ancient legend. If, that is, this is the real reason those inns are all so similar. I actually spent 2 nights here just to take in the atmosphere. I drank with a few new people near a cooking flame, which spewed its smoke up and out of the building in a very clean fashion. Every time I wanted a new drink, Corpulus was happy to oblige. The house special was a spiced wine, something I quite enjoyed, and also used to fill my carafe for the second night. Each of these bottles, as well as items on the food menu, were cleanly arranged in the storage room. Not once did I have a worry of my food being spoiled by pests, winking or otherwise. Instead, I just had a very pleasant time here, as it seems did many others. With all things considered, I believe this is the first 5-star rating I will grant in Skyrim. This place was worth climbing Solitude's steep hills. Continuing this breath of fresh air, we have another unique tavern within Whiterun called the Bannered Mare. Being part of a prosperous city in the center of the province, the establishment is quite successful and often busy. Its roof is cut somewhat like scales, matching the rest of the buildings in town, but whereas they all have dragons cut into their wooden support beams, the mare, aptly so, has horses. Between each horse is a divot between the roof segments, so that smoke from interior flames can dissipate. The walls of the building are engraved with unique designs, and in addition to the large windows, there are 3 tiny ones up above the door. To complete our exterior assessment, we should speak of the sign. This shows a Nord warrior riding a horse into war, wearing a battle standard, or rather, a banner. Immediately upon entry, I was graciously welcomed by Holda. A young woman named Sadia came to offer me refreshments, and this was the largest menu I had read thus far. Strangely, Holda's opinion of me quickly changed, randomly calling me a little I brushed this aside and told her I needed a room, at which she reacted normally. It was upstairs, and although spacious, there were a few problems with it. Firstly, the walls were cracked and threatened to crumble. There were many gaps and splits in the floorboard, and instead of each wall being decorated in unique styles, I found yet another wreath to haunt me. Food, drink, storage, and even a water basin for cleaning one's face were offered. The bed was nice too, just as good as the Winking Skeever. Just outside of my room was a nice balcony that looked over the main hall of the inn. From here, you could just barely feel remnants of the fire and listen to the bard playing below, which everyone greatly enjoyed. There was a lot of life in this place, despite how old and run down it was becoming. There were musicians, mercenaries, and of course, your general adventurers. An entire wing was dedicated as a kitchen space to prepare the huge menu for clients in the next room over. Although off limits, I could smell all the various foods lying in wait. So, despite Hulda's random comment that I didn't appreciate, I did have a great time here. I'll give this place a strong 5 stars, especially as compared to the other locations we visited. If I thought Hulda's comments were off-putting, it was nothing compared to those I received in Windhelm, the Stormcloak capital. In the center of town was a rigid stone structure known as Candlehearth Hall. The stone was an important choice, as wood can be affected heavily here by the repeated freezing and thawing. The windows were quite nice, and the brutalist dragon designs were interesting as well, calling to mind a question. Why is there still so much dragon iconography if they're feared by Nords? Is it out of respect, or a holdover from times when Kennereth bestowed upon mortals the gift of the voice? I took one last look at the sign, a trio of candles, before entering the place. What I received was worse than the odd look.
Another dark elf. Just what Windhelm needs.
Elda Early Dawn was a complete shrew. Mark my words, friends, if you are not a Nord, beware this place. It's full of racists, and the worst ones I've met to that end. I had to restrain myself in order to learn more about the tavern. Apparently the building was made by an old Nord warrior. When he passed, his son lit a candle on the hearth, and it never went out. Part of me wanted to extinguish it myself. All things considered, the room was not bad. It was certainly unique among others and came with some tools to iron my clothes, potions for restoration, a small amount of food, and a bed that was slightly better than those in poorer institutions, mostly because it was fully stocked with hay, and at least there was a door. Upstairs were many tables around the titular hearth where I saw 2 other Dunmer in attendance. It was a rare but welcome experience, and one of them was a bard. I wondered if they'd seen as much disregard as I had during my visit, and soon realized it must have been far worse. In fact, I applaud their resilience, because my patience was very quickly tested. A poor excuse for a man named Rolf started berating one of the women as I stood in plain view. She said nothing to him, but I was spoiling to teach him a lesson. I hope she enjoyed seeing me pummel him into the ground and take his money. After this, I followed him upstairs to see if I could learn more about why he hated my people. It seems he believed them to be Imperial spies, even though they simply needed a place to stay after the events of the Red Year. He also accused them of being leeches, even when they performed for them here at this very tavern, ran stores in the unfortunately named Grey Quarter, and hosted a tavern of their very own to bring revenue to town, despite their continued oppression. It seems others had had enough of Rolf as well, because when I fought him again, no one intervened, even when he brought out a knife and still lost. I fear for my people in this city, and I recommend none of you, Dunmer or otherwise, give Candlehearth Hall your business in any form. If they welcome bigots into the fold, you'd be none the better to raise a glass with them. At the very beginning of the study, I mentioned an exception to the rules, the primary one being that each tavern of discussion must have had a bed available at the time of my visit. Unfortunately, the New Nice's Corner Club did not, but I don't care. Eyes need placed on the way Dunmer live in Windhelm, and this is the time for me to share that information. Deep in the Grey Quarter, the run-down side of town that Dark Elves are crammed into, is the New Nice's Corner Club, the only tavern here that would welcome them. I spoke with Ambaris Rendar about the situation, and he confirmed all we know today. The guards do not care about the Dunmer, and Ulfric of course feels the same. The state of the building alone shows how poor the Dark Elves live. The walls are missing boards, spots are broken in the floors and ceiling, exposing the raw earth below. Banners are tattered completely in some cases. It's a rough spot. But that does not keep Ambaris down. Instead, he and his fellow Dunmer do their best to take care of the place and their own. Although not extravagant, the food here is clean and the drink just as strong. Whatever they can get, that is. They must have to scavenge from around the place or try to smuggle things in from the docks. Upstairs was another dining spot surrounded by items that tell a larger story. Although initially opposed to the Empire, many of my people were thankful for it when Red Mountain erupted again. Without the legions and their agreements with the great houses, they would have had nowhere to go. And so it makes sense that Ambaris would be a member, though not some sort of spy like Rolf suggested. He simply needed to enlist to survive. If this is the way a spy lives, then perhaps they're better suited to a different career, such as trying to run a tavern. I can only imagine how the uppermost level looks compared to those below. It would have to be even more treacherous with the rotten floorboards and caving ceiling. There'd be no assistance should anything happen to Ambaris, and I think he knows this. Even still, he does the best he can to cheer up his patrons, drinking to an old Nisus that is now covered in ash, miles and miles away. In a return to normalcy, we now come to the Nightgate Inn, which lies far to the west of Windhelm. This tavern looks and is much like similar places we've gone to. One defining characteristic is that there's a small pond with a dock where I assume the owner fished to fill his menu. The sign calls to mind those of Cyrodiil with a moon and multiple stars. Right beneath was a mammoth skull, and since they don't wander this far north from the tundra usually, I assumed it must have been brought here just for simple amusement. Something else I noticed out on the dock was a wealthy looking orc pondering the water, or maybe he was considering how best to fillet the caught fish nearby. Would he then sear them, cover them with lemon juice? That would need to be imported, of course. The main hall contained but a single wreath, that one of much distinction. There were also many deer skulls, one atop every pillar, and somehow another mammoth skull that hung from the wall above the bar. It must have had many bolts, ropes, and other materials holding it still, for if it didn't, well, goodbye Hadring. According to Hadring, the orc outside was a very intelligent man who made his money as a writer. He even rents out a permanent room to him below the tavern hall, where he can rest in peace. Otherwise, the inn does not get many visitors. Hadring stands just behind the bar, waiting to serve anyone who may chance by. My room for the night was a small one, but that was just as well. I wasn't expecting too much from the place. I was content to just drink with my friend at the nearest table and leave Windhelm far behind us. Winterhold is home to our last tavern of discussion in Skyrim. This inn, the Frozen Hearth, is represented by a furnace surrounded by spiral designs. At least, that's what I think it is. If all goes well, this place is also where I spotted my final snowberry wreath. As this town is quite small following the disaster that befell it, there are few places to group up for social occasions. The Hearth offers the best of these with a warm fire, food, alcohol, and plenty of seating. The rooms were lackluster, save for that of Nelicar, which was an apparently permanent fixture. He owned several books that lined the shelves and used a segment of the bar as his personal research table. How he swung that deal with Dagger, I will never know. He and his wife Haran run the place as best as they can, even though there are very few travelers that stop in. Most of the business comes from townspeople, such as Ranmir, a man who drinks quite often. Since losing their home in the disaster that sent half the town plummeting, Dagger and his wife built a place below the inn. It isn't glamorous, but it serves the function, while also offering space for business storage. At a certain point, I realized I had lost my companion. Turns out she'd drank too much and found herself downstairs, sampling the food and watching the family sleep. I very quickly pulled her away and would be discussing that with her later. The Frozen Hearth was perhaps the best example of an inn to finish our discussion of Skyrim on. It's very similar to many of the others, including the very same bar, shelves, side rooms, tables, and decoration. All according to Nordic tradition, following rules as rigid as the stone the inn was built upon. Although there are no more taverns to speak of in Skyrim, there's one 4th era business we should discuss to round out our study. In Raven Rock, a previously imperial colony rendered unto House Redoran, there exists a single bar that reminds me of home. This is the Retching Netch, a small, unassuming place dug straight into the ground, as all taverns should be. Its exterior is built from the carapaces of giant crustaceans and bugs, as is the natural style of Redoran and Vvardenfell, or as it used to be. Stepping inside filled me with much nostalgia and homesickness. Thankfully, I'd be back to Anasi soon, but I was still hit with such a bittersweet feeling, knowing what was to come. I chose to focus on the beauty of the room, its curved structures, and paper lanterns. Furniture was wrought from local materials, and as much of the wood both here and in Morrowind was burnt to a crisp, there wasn't much left to work with. Moving further below, the place opened wide. Here was the main bar where Gildus Sadri served all the classics. I spent a good amount of time just chatting with him, thanking him for the effort required to run this place, a piece of home so far away. Everyone here had a story to tell and a sorrow to vanquish. That's where the drinks came in. Ashfire Mead, Argonian Blood Wine, Sheen, Sujama, Mazte. Only grief was missing. And to that I say, oh well. I could smell the comberry in the booze, taste the past from the bottle, and think of the good times I would soon be returning to. If only I could provide that same feeling to all the people there. I truly wish I could have. But for now, the business was doing well, the Dunmer were finding their footing, and it just would not do to cause any havoc. Before asking about a room, I pressed Sadri on the name of the inn. Apparently a regular drunkard was walking on the docks, fully naked, drinking of course. He saw a netch and threw his bottle at the poor thing, and where the bottle exploded, the netch absorbed its contents. It flew on a tilt and spilled its last meal all over the dock. I was so concerned by the story that I almost forgot to pay for the rental. Sadri kindly led me to a large room down the hall. It was filled with food, potions, and ingredients, many of them native to Morrowind. There was a blend of Dunmeri and Nordic design in the furniture, something very interesting to witness. I didn't even mind the bed that was quite literally an animal skin on a plank of wood. Okay, so I did mind it. It was very uncomfortable, and call me biased, but I still liked the place. As the only tavern in Solstheim, and the only one that served native Morrowind cuisine and booze, I am essentially required to give this location 5 stars. Places like this remind me of why one should never give up, no matter how distraught they feel or how impossible the challenge may seem. It may not look like progress, but the fact that Dunmeri descendants are able to keep the culture alive is amazing. When you find yourself experiencing your own red year, remember to cover your eyes and press forward, because your every step is progress. Wherever you may land, I hope it's a comfortable place where you can rest and consider the journey, looking back to say, I made it. That is the definition of success, and it doesn't hurt to have a cold drink in your hand to celebrate. Apologies for the cheesy ending there. I think it's just something I needed to tell myself. I'm experiencing a red year of my own, and sometimes, like many others, I need to look at positives and reflect on the good that has happened in the world. I could say more, but we're here to talk about Skyrim. My thoughts on Skyrim's taverns are numerous. First, I want to speak about the positives. Most of the taverns here are super detailed. They include many more objects than the earlier titles, and for a while, they had the most visual quality. So much is told by the placement of things, the types of food eaten there, the way people sleep, and so on. And connecting more to the people, this is the first and only game with actual performing bards, many of whom are fully interactive and can even be requested to sing specific songs. Different voice actors sang as well, so there are various voices that come through with their own interpretations of songs, their own inflections, and their own flair. The way that patrons react to them is cool too, even if a little funny looking by today's standards. And some of the Skald are so talented that they can play instruments without the instrument even existing. There's also the brawls you can do, a good way to make money if you have the talent or levels necessary. Then there are the mercenaries, such as the super cool person in the Drunken Huntsman, which I wanted to include but it had no beds for resting. For a certain cost, they'll accompany you on adventures until they pass or are released from service. These are all very interesting concepts and do serve to make the place more realistic. Even the hateful characters of Windhelm offer an exceptional insight into the Civil War and the opinions on either side. As someone who plays as a Dunmer most often, I genuinely enjoyed beating Rolf up for his comments. What makes everything far less realistic are my primary problems with the taverns. First, most of them look exactly the same on the exterior. Of the 18 inns in Skyrim, including the Retching Netch, there are 11 that look identical to the Sleeping Giant, with some containing snow on top. I didn't want to compare the inns between games, especially concerning visual detail with the Oblivion remaster, but still, let's look at some figures. Morrowind also had 18 inns. Of these, there were 2 lookalikes in Redoran style, 2 lookalikes in Imperial style, and 4 mushroom-based taverns. Every single one of these used different room structures, colored lighting, character arrangements, table styles, etc. to set them apart. Even in the most similar case, those of the Redoran inns, it was really only the shape of the interior and the entryway arrangement that was similar. Everything else was changed. Every other tavern in Morrowind was unique, even those in Vivec City or Balmora. When it comes to Oblivion, there were 34 inns. Of course, there would be some repeats. Looking at actual numbers, it comes out to the following. Out of 34 inns, 22 are fully unique in layout. They may borrow the same architectural styles, such as in the Imperial City taverns, but they're not the same exterior or interior layout in a strict sense. The 3 repeated styles are what I would call Ayleswell style, with 4 iterations, Brina Cross style, with 6, and Border Watch style, with 2. Everything else is unique. Being kind to Skyrim and lumping these as the exact same, we find the following. 77.78% of Morrowind's taverns are unique. 64.71% of Oblivion's taverns are unique. And finally, 38.89% of Skyrim's taverns are unique in structure, less than half of them. Now, as mentioned, in the cases of Morrowind and Oblivion's repeats, the interiors are often rearranged and altered so as to make them somewhat distinct. This is not often the case in Skyrim. I try to keep an in-universe reason in mind for certain elements of the games, especially where there's a clear limitation. This is not due to limitation. Unfortunately, I believe this is just lazy. Skyrim's 11 taverns were copy and pasted to the degree that the creators somehow even copied the same mistaken wreath in every one of them. At least I can't remember one that didn't contain the glitched wreath. Stranger still, it's of a smaller scale than the normal one. As I was working on the video, I realized I didn't know much about Skyrim's creation kit. I knew that the wreath must have been accidentally copied with the ends, but not what piece it was attached to or selected with. Turns out, it isn't attached to a singular pole or anything, as those are part of a Lego piece that connects to make the inn. If you wanted to, you could copy these central pieces and make the longest lodge in Skyrim's history. It still doesn't explain the wreath. So what I'm thinking is, they deleted all the items in the tavern except for set tables, lighting, bars, the 2 repeated shelves, the fire pit, the repeated rooms, the hanging spices, and so on. Then, not seeing the wreath in the corner, which may have been placed as a prank or on accident, they simply copied and pasted the thing as a template for every other inn. From here, they lazily shifted a bed or two, moved a shelf over, or even not in most cases. This is really sad. I began the Skyrim section certain that it was going to blow the others out of the water, but as I noticed the repeated wreath, I began to notice the other things. And now, cursed with the knowledge, I'll never get over this. This is my largest complaint about the inns. I like that you can get quests from them like the old days of the first games. I like the interactivity, but I don't want to credit laziness with a deep lore-based reason for it. I think they got away with it for some time, but looking at Oblivion again, there's really no comparison. Skyrim's inns are rough, and the sleeping bonuses aren't even worth risking my mental connection to the world and its story. They remove me from it entirely. Wow. This was way longer than I meant it to be. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I did making it. I learned a lot about all the various inns, their creation, and the little stories hidden within them. Despite their level of craft, each adds to the world of Tamriel in its own way. I want to thank you for watching to the end, as well as my patrons and channel members for having my back. These include the following: Rumor Raisin, Rachel, Rini M, Squiggy, A Sparky, and Sarah Smith. Not a day goes by where I don't appreciate your support. To that end, if you would like to support me in continuing these videos, please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think of them in the comments. Patreon is another option where you can get updates on video progress as well as other things I'm interested in, such as video game console repair and mushroom farming. I'm working on finding a good balance for streaming as well, and channel members have access to priority replies, goofy emoticons, and so on. All of these methods help me to continue making videos. I couldn't justify the time spent without your support. Thank you all so much. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.